The emergency room went dead silent when 5 Navy SEALs walked through the doors of Bayside General Hospital, combat boots on linoleum, rifles slung, blood still wet on their sleeves, and stopped in front of a nurse mopping a supply cart near the wall. The men stood at attention. And then they saluted her, not the ER director standing 6 feet away with his arms crossed, not the chief of surgery already striding forward with his hand extended, not anyone with a title or a badge or a corner office. A nurse. A woman everyone in this building had spent 6 months calling slow, incompetent, and washed up. Nobody in that room understood what they were seeing. They were about to. Before you find out what happened next, if you've never been here before, hit subscribe right now, because this channel runs stories that will make your jaw drop, and I would hate for you to miss what's coming. Hit the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment below telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The thing about Mara Donnelly was that she never looked like someone with secrets. That was, of course, the point. She was 41 years old, medium height, with dark hair she kept pulled back in a bun so tight it sometimes gave her headaches. She wore plain navy scrubs and the kind of sensible shoes you bought on clearance because you were on your feet for 12 hours straight and had stopped caring about aesthetics 3 jobs ago. 3. She walked with a slight drag in her right leg. Not a limp exactly, more like a hesitation, like the leg was asking permission to continue. And she kept her eyes down most of the time, not because she was timid, but because she had learned a long time ago that being seen was a choice, and right now she was choosing not to be. She had been at Bayside General Hospital in Creston Falls, Washington for 7 months. She rented a 1-bedroom apartment 7 blocks away, paid her bills on time, and did not socialize with colleagues beyond what politeness required. She brought her own lunch, always something quick and practical. A wrap, an apple, a thermos of coffee she made at 4 in the morning before the sun came up. She did not go to the hospital birthday parties. She did not sign up for the charity 5K. She did not join the group chat the night nurses had set up on their phones. She was, by most definitions, invisible. The nursing staff at Bayside General had their own way of categorizing people. There were the good nurses, sharp, confident, the ones who caught things before the doctors did and never got credit for it. There were the mediocre nurses, competent enough, clocked in, clocked out, no damage done. And then there were the ones people talked about in the break room, the ones who inspired the kind of whispered conversations that stopped the moment the subject walked through the door. Mara Donnelly was firmly in the 3rd category. "She's just slow," said Priya, one of the day shift charge nurses, to anyone who would listen. "I've watched her. She takes twice as long as anyone else to start an IV, and when Dr. Ashworth asked her to pull a chart last week, she stood there for 30 seconds, like she'd forgotten how hospitals work." "She seems nervous," another nurse offered once, charitably. "She's been here 7 months," Priya said. "Nervous doesn't last 7 months." This was the story that had settled around Mara like sediment. She was past her prime, maybe, or burned out, or simply not built for the pace of a level 2 trauma center. Someone in administration had murmured something about her record being unusual. Gaps, transfers, nothing that added up cleanly. But no one had pressed it, because the paperwork cleared and the hospital needed warm bodies for night shift, and Mara Donnelly showed up every time she was supposed to and never called in sick. The emergency department at Bayside General was run, with the enthusiasm of a man who had spent 15 years waiting to run something, by Dr. Russell Greer. Greer was 53, barrel-chested, with the kind of silver-templed good looks that made hospital donors feel their money was in competent hands. He had a fellowship from a university with a name people recognized, a wife who sat on the hospital foundation board, and a management style that could be charitably described as results-oriented and more accurately described as militaristic in a way that had never actually served in the military. He did not like Mara Donnelly. He had made this clear within her first 2 weeks, in the particular way that people in positions of authority sometimes make things clear, not with anything you could put in writing, but with tone, with dismissal, with the small daily architecture of being overlooked. "Carter, Donnelly, whatever her name is," he'd said once to his senior resident, Dr. Theo Sato, and then corrected himself without embarrassment, as though her name were an inconvenience he hadn't gotten around to solving. "Night shift. Keep her out of complex cases." It was a Tuesday in November when everything started to unravel. Mara was 40 minutes into her shift when the radio traffic began. She heard it the way she heard most things, from a slight distance, filing it quietly, the way you'd track a sound in a dark room without turning toward it. The dispatch frequency was open at the nursing station, routine, and what came through at first didn't sound like anything beyond ordinary chaos. A vehicle accident on Route 9, multiple casualties, ETA 12 minutes. But then the second transmission came, and Mara went still. The language was clipped, efficient, built for people who spoke in incomplete sentences and understood anyway. Most of the nurses at the station didn't catch what she caught. They heard military personnel and helicopter mechanical failure and trauma protocol and started moving with the predictable urgency of people executing a plan they'd rehearsed. What Mara heard, underneath all of it, was a designation, a unit classification. Something she hadn't heard in 4 years that made the base of her skull go cold. She set down the chart she was holding without making a sound. She rechecked the supply cart, trauma shears, IV kits, chest seal packaging, and began moving toward the trauma bay with the particular kind of calm that isn't the absence of feeling but the deliberate containment of it, the way you'd hold your breath crossing a stream. Dr. Greer was already there when she arrived. He saw her and frowned. "Donnelly, I need you on triage overflow tonight, not—" "They're going to need 3 trauma bays," she said quietly, "and someone should get the thoracic surgical kit from OR storage, not the standard cart. The chest seal applicators on the standard cart are the old generation. They're slower." Greer stared at her for a moment. "How do you know what's coming in?" "I was listening to the radio." "The radio said multiple casualty vehicle accident." "The radio said that first," Mara said. "The second transmission said something different." Greer looked at her the way he always looked at her, like she was a problem he hadn't chosen and couldn't be bothered to properly solve. "Go to triage overflow," he said. "I'll handle this." Mara went. But she didn't go far. She stationed herself at the edge of the corridor, close enough to see into the main trauma bay, and she watched the team arrange itself with the particular organized confidence of people who were very good at the wrong preparation. They were setting up for blunt force trauma, for road rash and fractures and the kind of injuries that came from steel and asphalt and speed. They were setting up for the accident they'd been told about. They weren't ready for what was actually coming through those doors. The ambulances arrived at 9:47 p.m. The first 2 patients were straightforward by trauma standards: a fractured femur, scalp lacerations, a shoulder dislocation that would hurt like hell and be fine by Thursday. The team handled them smoothly, Greer moving with the confident authority he was good at when the situation fit his template. Then the third gurney came through. Mara saw him the moment the paramedics pushed through. Male, late 30s, heavily built, cut from his gear but still in partial uniform, with the kind of body that spoke to years of specific physical conditioning. His color was wrong, not the bright red wrong of active hemorrhage, not the gray wrong of shock in its obvious stages, but something subtler and more dangerous, a dusky undertone that someone not looking for it would miss entirely. She was already moving before she'd made the conscious decision to move. "His neck veins," she said, arriving at the gurney before the team had fully positioned it. "Look at his neck veins." Dr. Sato glanced up from the patient beside him. "We've got him, Donnelly." "His neck veins are distended," she said, not loudly, but with a specificity that cut through the noise. "And his trachea is deviated to the left. Can you hear that breathing?" There was a brief, uncertain pause in the room. "Donnelly," Greer started. "It's tension pneumothorax," Mara said. "He has maybe 3 minutes before his heart stops being able to function. Someone needs to decompress his chest right now." The room went sharp and still in the way rooms go when something stops being background noise and starts being the only thing. Greer looked at the patient, looked at the monitors being connected, looked at Mara standing at the gurney with her hands on the side rail, completely steady. "You don't make clinical decisions in this department," he said. "You are not a physician." "I know what I'm looking at. Step back." The monitor connected. The heart rate on the screen was wrong, elevated, irregular, climbing. The oxygen saturation was 81 and falling. Mara watched Greer look at the numbers, watched him recalibrate, watched the decision move across his face. Not the right decision, not fast enough. The decision of a man trying to protect his authority while also not letting someone die in front of him, which was the kind of delay that killed people. She reached past him, not aggressively, Not with drama. She simply reached past him the way you reach across someone for something they're not picking up, and she had the needle in her hand, 14 gauge, already drawn. And she placed her fingers on the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, with the muscle memory of someone who had done this in the dark, in the rain, in conditions that made this sterile trauma bay look like a luxury. "Don't," Greer started. She pushed the needle in. The hiss of released pressure was audible. The numbers on the monitor began to change within seconds. The room was absolutely silent. Mara withdrew the needle, kept her eyes on the patient's chest, watched his breathing mechanics shift. She counted silently. She checked the tracheal position with 2 fingers. She watched the color in his face begin to return from the wrong shade to something closer to human. Then she stepped back. She didn't say anything. She set the needle in the sharps container and moved to the side of the room, out of the way, back to her position near the wall. Her leg was aching. It always ached when she stood on hard floors for too long. And she shifted her weight and folded her hands in front of her and waited. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Dr. Sato was staring at the monitor. The paramedic at the foot of the gurney was staring at Mara. 2 nurses who had frozen during the moment were now moving again, the motion returning to the room like water rushing back after a wave. Greer turned to look at her. His expression was not gratitude. It was something harder and colder than that. The look of a man who had just watched someone do something he couldn't have done as quickly, in front of people who had seen it. "You're going to have a very serious conversation with administration tomorrow," he said. Mara looked at him. "Okay," she said. "You interfered with a physician's active care of a patient. The patient is breathing," she said. "That is not—" "Dr. Greer," the voice came from the doorway. Everyone turned. The man standing in the doorway was not in scrubs. He was in tactical clothing, still mud-streaked from whatever had brought them here, with the specific bearing of someone who had spent years in environments where your bearing was the thing that kept other people calm. He had a bandage on his forearm, freshly applied, and he was walking with a controlled evenness that suggested he was injured but had decided not to be slowed by it. He was looking past Greer. He was looking at Mara. His eyes moved from her face to her leg to her hands and back to her face, and something changed in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a piece of information confirming itself. "I need to talk to you," he said. He was talking to Mara. Greer turned to look at her, then back at the man. "Excuse me, this is an active trauma." "I know where I am," the man said, without raising his voice and without any particular emotion, just the simple factual confidence of someone who was used to the volume of his presence carrying the room. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Daniel Voss, United States Navy. The man your nurse just saved is Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb. He's part of my unit." He paused. "And I need to speak to her." The room was very quiet. Greer looked at Mara. Mara looked at Lieutenant Commander Voss. Something passed between them. Not a greeting, more like a moment of mutual recognition, the kind that happens between people who have a shared reference point that nobody else in the room possesses. Mara's expression didn't change. She kept it deliberately still, which was itself a kind of answer. "I'm working," she said. "I know," Voss said. "This won't take long." She crossed to the doorway. Voss stepped slightly aside, and they moved into the corridor just beyond the trauma bay entrance, close enough that she could still see Marcus Webb's monitor through the glass. Voss looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, "When did you transfer out?" 4 years ago. "We didn't know you were here." That was the idea. He nodded once, the nod of someone accepting a fact rather than judging it. "You saw the tension pneumo before anyone else in the room?" "Yes." "How long before?" Mara thought about it. 2 minutes, maybe. Maybe a little more. Voss exhaled slowly, looked back through the glass at his man on the gurney. He would have been dead. "Yes," she said. "He would have been." There was a pause. The monitor beeped steadily. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed. "The other's coming in," Mara said. "How many?" 2 more. One's stable, one's not. The unstable one has a abdominal presentation?" Voss looked at her. "How did you—" "The radio transmission. There was a reference to mechanism of injury. High velocity, lateral impact, restrained occupant. That pattern hits the spleen and the liver. If the hemorrhage control wasn't addressed immediately at the scene, He's going to be in distress when he gets here. She looked down the corridor toward the ambulance bay. Did your medic get to him at the scene? He did what he could. That gives us a window, she said. Small one. She turned and walked back into the trauma bay. Greer was still standing near Marcus Webb's gurney, talking to Sato in a low voice. He looked up when she came back in, and his expression sharpened. Donnelly, I told you. There are 2 more coming, she said. One of them has probable splenic or hepatic injury. He's going to need imaging immediately on arrival, and you should have the interventional radiology team on standby because he is going to need embolization. Not surgery first, embolization first, then surgery if the bleeding doesn't respond. That's the sequence that saves him. Greer stared at her. That is not a nursing assessment, he said. No, she agreed. It's not. The silence stretched. Who are you? He asked. It was the first time he had ever asked her that question with any genuine interest in the answer. Mara looked at him steadily. Tonight, she said, I'm the person who knows what's coming through that door. Tomorrow you can decide what to do with me. She turned to the supply cart, and she started preparing. Greer did not stop her. Maybe it was the monitor still beeping steadily behind him, proof that something had happened that he couldn't explain away. Maybe it was something in her voice, not defiant, not emotional, just absolutely certain in a way that was harder to argue with than anything loud. Maybe it was the look on Voss's face, visible through the corridor glass, watching everything with the still attention of a man who was calculating odds. Whatever it was, Greer picked up the phone and called interventional radiology. The second ambulance arrived 6 minutes later. The patient, young, mid-20s, the kind of physical condition that made the pallor of his skin look wrong against the baseline of what his body should be, came in with a belly that was wrong. Rigid in the wrong places, tender on palpation, the subtle guarding that meant the body was protecting something that was bleeding. Mara was already at the gurney. She didn't push anyone aside. She moved into the space where she was useful, opposite side from Dr. Sato, who was managing airway, clear of Greer, who was at the monitor. And she assessed with her hands while the rest of the team connected leads and drew blood and did the things that looked like action. How long since injury? She asked the paramedic. 31 minutes. Pressure at scene? 86/50. And now? The paramedic checked. 92/58. Compensating, Mara said, more to herself than anyone. Not responding to fluids, he's holding, but not improving. She straightened up and looked across the patient at Greer. He needs CT now, not labs first. The labs will confirm what the CT shows, and every minute we wait for results, he's losing ground. Greer met her eyes. Something moved behind his resistance, evaluation, and then, unwillingly, a decision. CT Bay, he said to the team. Mara stepped back. She didn't follow. She wasn't authorized for CT, and she knew where the lines were, even if tonight she was standing in an unusual relationship to some of them. She stayed in the trauma bay, watched through the glass as the gurney moved, and then turned back to the room. Marcus Webb was more stable now. His oxygen sat had climbed to 96. He was conscious, groggy, and blinking at the ceiling with the careful attention of someone reacquainting themselves with being alive. One of the nurses was taking his blood pressure. Another was adjusting his IV line. He turned his head slowly and looked at Mara. She was standing 12 feet away, back near the wall, arms folded, watching his monitor. "Hey," he said. His voice was rough. She looked at him. "You're the one who—" He stopped, swallowed. "You're the one who did the needle thing." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I could feel myself going, right before, that—" He stopped again. "That feeling. You know what I mean?" "Yes," she said. I know what you mean." He looked at her for a long moment with the specific, unguarded gratitude of someone who doesn't have the energy left to perform anything other than sincerity. "Thank you," he said. Mara nodded once. "Rest," she said. "You're okay now." She looked back at his monitor. The numbers were good. She let out a slow, controlled breath and did not let her hands shake. Down the corridor, she could hear the CT bay, the muffled activity of the team working the second patient, Greer's voice giving instructions in a tone that was slightly less certain than his usual register. She heard Sato reading aloud from preliminary results. She heard the word spleen, and then embolization, and then, after a pause, the sound of a phone being picked up. He was calling interventional radiology. She had been right. She looked at the wall and felt the familiar weight of that, being right about something no one would thank her for, in a room where being right was always slightly suspicious coming from her. Outside, in the corridor, she could see Lieutenant Commander Voss. I was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching the trauma bay through the glass. He hadn't left. He was waiting for something. Waiting for her, she understood. She had known this was coming from the moment she'd recognized the unit designation on the radio. Not Voss specifically, because she hadn't known it would be him, but someone. Someone who would know. Someone who would look at her and see past the scrubs and the sensible shoes and the deliberately unremarkable surface she had spent 4 years constructing. She had built that surface carefully, piece by piece, choice by choice. She had taken a job in a mid-sized hospital in a city where she knew no one. She had kept her record vague, not falsified, not fraudulent, just stripped of the details that would make anyone look twice. She had learned to walk slowly in the hallways, to hesitate before answering, to let people draw their own conclusions. It wasn't deception, it was omission. People saw what you let them see. She had let them see a middle-aged nurse who wasn't very fast, and for 7 months, it had worked perfectly. She looked at Marcus Webb's monitor one more time. His sats were holding at 97. His heart rate was coming down into a normal range. His color was almost human. She had saved his life in approximately 45 seconds. Nobody in this room yet fully understood what that meant. Down the hall, she heard the interventional radiology team arrive. The rolling sound of their equipment cart, the specific vocabulary of people preparing to do something precise and complicated. The second patient, whose name she didn't know yet, would probably never know, was getting the care he needed. The sequence she had described to Greer was the sequence playing out. She thought about the next 12 hours. She thought about the conversation Greer had promised her with administration. She thought about Voss in the hallway, waiting. She thought about the other SEALs who would be coming in with the remaining casualties. She didn't know how many, the radio traffic had been unclear, and whether any of them would recognize her, and if they did, what that would do to the careful, quiet structure she had built around herself in this place. She thought about Marcus Webb looking at her with those open, exhausted eyes and saying, "You know what I mean," and meaning something that almost nobody in her current life was capable of meaning. She crossed to the medication cart, updated her charting on the wall-mounted tablet, entered the clinical notes for the interventions in a straightforward, factual way that did not omit what had happened but did not editorialize either. She documented the presentation, the assessment, the intervention, the patient response. She signed it with her name and her credentials and the time. Let them decide what to do with it. Priya came through the bay at some point, the charge nurse from day shift, staying late for some administrative reason, pausing near the door to look at the scene. She looked at Marcus Webb, then at the 2 nurses managing his recovery, then at Mara standing by the cart. "What happened?" Priya asked. "No one in particular." "Tension pneumo on arrival," one of the nurses said. "Needle decompression." "Who did it?" A pause. "Donnelly." Priya looked at Mara. Mara looked back at her and said nothing. Priya's expression did something complicated. The start of a question, the retreat from a question, a small recalibration that didn't quite resolve into anything coherent. She walked back out. Greer came back 20 minutes later. His expression was different. Not softer exactly, but stripped of the comfortable certainty it usually carried. He looked like a man who had been proven right about a sequence of events and was now in the uncomfortable position of owing that sequence to someone he had already decided to remove from his department. He stopped beside Mara. He didn't say anything for a moment. "The IR team confirmed splenic laceration," he said finally. "Grade 3. They're managing it." "Good," Mara said. "Your call on the embolization sequence was—" He stopped. "Accurate?" His jaw tightened. "Yes." She waited. "I still intend to report the unauthorized intervention to administration," he said. "I know. What you did with the needle, he would be dead." "That is not the relevant point." "It's the only point," she said quietly, and looked at him and waited for him to argue with her. He didn't. He walked away. Mara turned back to the room. The 3rd ambulance arrived 11 minutes later. This time, when the doors opened and the gurney came through, Mara saw four things in rapid sequence: the patient's uniform, his rank insignia, the specific equipment modifications on his vest that hadn't been fully removed by the paramedics, and the face of the man walking in beside the gurney. She stopped breathing for exactly 2 seconds. The man beside the gurney was Chief Warrant Officer Raymond Holt. She hadn't seen Raymond Holt in 4 years. The last time, it had been in a forward operating base in a country she was no longer supposed to talk about in unclassified settings. And he had been arguing with a logistics officer about medevac timing while she was finishing a procedure on a patient in a building with no roof. And he had looked across the dust and the noise and given her a single nod that meant good work, and we're moving in 10 minutes, and I'm glad you're here, all at once. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. He slowed. Then he stopped. The gurney kept moving. The paramedics and the nurse from the intake desk were managing it, the motion of the room continuing around this stopped point. And Holt stood in the middle of the trauma bay entrance and looked at Mara with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between relief and a kind of careful wariness, as if he wasn't sure whether finding her here was a good thing or a problem. "Donnelly," he said. His voice was low enough that only she could hear it. "Chief Holt," she said. "You're here." "I'm here." He looked at her leg. The reflex of it, the assessment. She'd seen that look before from people who knew her history, the quick involuntary inventory of the damage. Then he looked back at her face. "We need to talk," he said. "When you're done." "You're the second person tonight who said that to me." Something moved in his face. "Voss is here too?" In the corridor. Holt exhaled, looked around the bay, looked at Marcus Webb's gurney, at the monitors, at the order and controlled activity of the room that had not been controlled 45 minutes ago. "What did you do?" he asked. "Decompressed attention pneumo," she said, and redirected a second patient to IR before CT labs. He looked at her for a long moment. "How bad is it going to be for you?" he asked. Not casually, with the specific concern of someone who understood exactly what it meant for someone in her position to have done those things in front of those people. "I don't know yet," she said. "Bad, probably." "Greer?" "He's already promised me a conversation with administration." Holt's expression tightened. "He's going to try to fire you." "Most likely." "Over saving 2 lives." "Over practicing outside my scope," she said, "which is technically accurate. I am not a physician, and I performed clinical interventions that are outside my nursing license. He's not wrong about the technical violation." "He doesn't know who you are." "No," she said. "He doesn't." Holt looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of anger, or maybe just a deep tiredness at the predictability of certain kinds of people. "Are you going to tell him?" "No," Mara said. He waited. "You are," she said. Holt blinked. Then something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the expression of a man recognizing a quality in someone he'd always known was there. "That's why you said it so calmly," he said. "I'm not calm," she said. "I'm just tired of pretending I don't know what I know." She turned back to the patient on the new gurney. She looked at his presentation, made 3 rapid assessments in the time it took her to cross the floor, and positioned herself at the head of the gurney where the airway management was going to be. "Airway's going to compromise," she said to the room. Dr. Sato looked up. She looked at him steadily. "Trust me," she said. "Airway's going to compromise." And 7 seconds later, the monitor alarmed. And she was already ready. Somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Russell Greer was typing up his incident report. He was writing the phrases unauthorized clinical intervention and breach of scope of practice, and immediate administrative review recommended. And he was feeling the particular satisfaction of a man who had found a legitimate framework within which to remove someone he had always found inconvenient. He did not yet know that in the corridor outside the trauma bay, 2 men who knew exactly who Mara Donnelly was were making a phone call. He did not yet know what that phone call was going to set in motion. He did not yet know that the quiet nurse he had spent 7 months dismissing had a record that would stop his incident report cold. A record that was not publicly available, that was not in her hospital file, that was held in a database that Dr. Russell Greer had absolutely no clearance to access. He did not yet know any of this. He kept typing. In the trauma bay, Mara Donnelly finished managing the airway, stepped back, noted the time on the monitor, and returned to the wall. She looked at her hands. They were steady. They had always been steady. That was one of the things she had never been able to change about herself. No matter how carefully she had constructed the version of herself that limped through hallways and deferred to doctors and allowed herself to be called slow. Under pressure, her hands were always, completely, steady. The night was not over. She turned back to the room and waited for what was coming next. The night did not slow down after that. That was the thing nobody told you about shifts like this one. They didn't build to a peak and then release. They just kept building, layer over layer, and you either found a way to stay ahead of the pressure or you got buried in it. Mara had learned that a long time ago in places that made this hospital look like somewhere you went to rest. And she drew on that knowledge now the same way she drew on everything else from that life. Quietly, without advertising it, in the margins of moments when nobody was watching closely enough to notice. The third patient, the one whose airway she had called before the monitor caught it, was a 26-year-old named, according to his dog tags, Petty Officer First Class James Kowalski. He stabilized after intubation. The intubation itself had been Sato's. Mara had positioned herself correctly, confirmed her read, and then stepped back and let the physician do the physician's work. Because there was a difference between knowing something needed to happen and insisting on being the one to make it happen, and that difference mattered tonight more than it usually did. She was already on thin ice. She knew exactly how thin. Greer had disappeared somewhere around the 90-minute mark, which was not unusual for him. He had a habit of managing crises from a position of administrative distance once the acute phase resolved, which was a diplomatic way of saying he was better at arriving at the start and at the end than at remaining present through the difficult middle. What was unusual was that when he came back with someone. Mara saw them from across the bay. The woman with Greer was Nina Ashby, the hospital's director of patient services, which was an administrative title that covered a portfolio of responsibilities, including, notably, nursing oversight. Ashby was in her mid-50s trim, with the specific composure of someone who had spent decades being the person called in when something had gone sideways and needed to be managed before it became a liability. She wore reading glasses on a chain and carried a tablet, and she looked at the trauma bay with the expression of someone performing a quiet inventory. Then she looked at Mara. Mara looked back at her and said nothing. Greer leaned toward Ashby and said something close to her ear. Ashby nodded once, twice, and wrote something on her tablet without looking up. Then she looked up and crossed the bay toward Mara with the measured stride of someone who had done this before and was not looking forward to doing it again, but was going to do it correctly regardless. "Miss Donnelly," she said, "I'm Nina Ashby." "I know who you are," Mara said. "Then you know why I'm here." "Dr. Greer has concerns about the interventions I performed tonight," Mara said. "He wants them documented and reviewed." "That's accurate." Ashby glanced down at her tablet. "I've read his preliminary notes. I'm also aware that the two patients involved are both currently alive and stable." "Yes." "I'm not here to adjudicate that tonight," Ashby said, "but I do need to place you on administrative leave pending review. Effective end of shift." The word leave landed in the air between them with a particular flatness. Mara had been expecting it. She had known it was coming from the moment she'd pushed the needle in. And knowing something is coming doesn't make it feel better when it arrives. It just means you've had more time to make peace with it. "Understood," she said. "This isn't a termination," Ashby added, and her tone softened by approximately 2 degrees, which was as much warmth as the situation probably allowed. "It's a formal review process. You'll have the opportunity to present your account of the events." "I know how it works," Mara said. Ashby looked at her for a moment. The kind of look that was doing more than reading the surface, that was trying to locate something in the gaps. Then she said, "Is there anything you'd like to tell me right now before you finish your shift?" Mara thought about this. "No," she said. Ashby nodded. "End of shift, then. And please, no further clinical interventions beyond standard nursing scope for the remainder of tonight." "I understand." Ashby walked back across the bay toward Greer. He was watching Mara with his arms crossed, and when Ashby reached him, he said something that made her nod and write something else on the tablet. Then they both walked out. Mara turned back to the room. James Kowalski's monitor beeped steadily at 98%. She stood beside his gurney and listened to the beeping and thought about nothing in particular for about 30 seconds, which was all the time she could afford. Then she heard boots in the corridor. Not one set, Several. The specific cadence of people who moved in coordination without needing to look at each other to stay in step. She looked toward the doorway and saw them coming around the corner. Voss first, then Holt, and then behind them 4 more men in various states of tactical dress, all bearing the specific stripped-down authority of people who had not come here to be managed. Voss stopped at the bay entrance and looked at Mara. "She's being put on leave," he said. It was not a question. "End of shift," Mara said. Something moved through the group. Not anger exactly, more a collective tightening, the shift in posture that happened when men who operated by very clear standards of cause and effect were confronted with an institutional response that didn't make sense to them. Holt stepped forward. "That's what they're doing." "It's protocol," Mara said. "I performed interventions outside my license. There's a process. The process can—" One of the men behind Holt started, and Holt put up one hand without looking back, and the sentence stopped. "Who do we talk to?" Voss asked. "That's not Mara." His voice was not loud. It was the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud because the weight of it was already enough. "We're not asking you for permission. We're asking you where to go." She looked at him, then at Holt, then at the 4 men standing in the corridor with the patient stillness of people who were waiting to be pointed in a direction. "Nina Ashby," she said, "Director of Patient Services, but what?" "Don't do anything that makes this harder," she said. "Whatever you're thinking of doing, don't make it about pressure. Make it about information. If you push, they push back, and I'm the one they push back on." Voss held her gaze for a long moment. "We know how to do this," he said. She believed him. She just didn't know if the people they were about to talk to did. The rest of her shift passed in a particular kind of suspended quality. She was present, she did her work, she checked her patients and updated her charting and responded to the nurses around her with the same quiet efficiency she always brought. But underneath all of it was the awareness that she was doing these things for the last time in this configuration, that the version of her life she had constructed at Bayside General was already dissolving whether or not the paperwork had caught up to that fact yet. At 2:30 in the morning, she checked Marcus Webb one final time before Priya's early shift rotation came in. His pressure was good, his breathing was unlabored. He was asleep, which was the best thing for him, and she stood beside his bed for a moment longer than strictly necessary, listening to him breathe. He opened his eyes. "You're leaving," he said. He said it the way people said things when they'd been asleep but not deeply, hovering near the surface. "Shift's ending," she said. "That's not what I mean." He looked at her with the specific clarity that sometimes came in the early hours of recovery, when the painkillers had leveled off and the fog had lifted enough to see clearly. "They're making you leave." She didn't confirm or deny it. "Because of what you did," he said. "There's a process," she said, the same words she'd said to Voss, the same even delivery. Marcus Webb looked at her for a long time. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard," he said, without any particular heat in it, just a simple factual exhaustion. "Get some sleep," she said. I'm going to talk to someone." "Voss already is." "Not Voss," Webb said. "Someone else." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the solid, unmovable quality of someone who had made a decision and was simply informing her of it, rather than asking. "Rest first," she said. "You had a pneumothorax 4 hours ago." "I know what I had," he said. "I was there." She almost smiled. Almost. She gathered her things from the staff locker at 4 a.m. and walked out of Bayside General through the ambulance bay entrance, the one she always used because the parking lot was closer and the corridor was quieter. The morning was still dark and cold, with the particular damp cold of the Pacific Northwest that settled in the bones and didn't move even when you put on a coat. She stood at her car for a moment with her hand on the door handle and breathed the outside air and looked at the hospital she had just walked out of. 7 months. Not the longest she'd ever held a position. Not the shortest. Long enough to know the rhythms of the building, the way the ventilation system hummed differently on the overnight, which vending machine took your dollar without arguing, which elevator was slowest, which attending would actually listen, and which ones were performing listening while already deciding, long enough to become invisible. She drove home and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table with her coat still on because it took a while for the apartment to warm up, and she wasn't in the mood to wait, and she sat there for a long time not doing much of anything. She wasn't afraid exactly. Fear was something she'd had a complicated relationship with for years. It wasn't that she didn't feel it, it was that she'd learned to disaggregate it from decision-making, to let it exist in its own lane while the rest of her brain did the work it needed to do. What she felt right now was something closer to the particular stillness that came before a decision. She had been choosing invisibility for 4 years. She had been choosing it deliberately and with full understanding of what she was trading for it. What she'd gotten in exchange was quiet and predictability and mornings without mission briefs, and the particular piece of being a person who could walk to the corner store without running a threat assessment on the parking lot. She had wanted that. She still wanted it. But the thing about last night was that it had proved something she'd been trying not to prove. You could take a person out of the work. You couldn't take the work out of the person. Not really. Not when it counted. She had moved before the decision was fully formed. She had seen what the room wasn't seeing, and she had acted. And somewhere in the middle of that action there had been a moment, very brief, very specific, where she had felt like herself again. Not the self she'd built here, the careful, muted, unremarkable self. The other one. The one that had her own hands in the dark and still didn't shake. She sat with that for a while. At 6:15 in the morning, her phone rang. She looked at the number before she answered. It was a Creston Falls area code she didn't recognize. "Donnelly," she said. "Ms. Donnelly." The voice on the other end was male, formal, the specific formality of someone who had been trained in a particular kind of institutional communication. "This is Thomas Everett from the Office of the Regional Military Liaison. I apologize for the early hour. I was asked to reach you by Lieutenant Commander Voss." "I figured," she said. "I understand you're aware of the review process initiated by Bayside General Hospital." "I am." "I want to make you aware," Everett said, "that there are individuals within the military community who have requested the opportunity to provide testimony regarding last night's events, should this proceed to a formal administrative hearing." "Testimony," she said. "Character, performance, and contextual testimony, yes. Specifically regarding your training background and your qualifications." Mara was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Everett, I appreciate the gesture, but the hospital isn't questioning my qualifications. They're questioning my scope of practice. Those are different things." "Yes," Everett said. "And the individuals who would be testifying understand that distinction. What they intend to provide is not a defense of the specific action, but a factual account of what those actions were, in context, including what they were consistent with." She understood what he was saying. "My service record." "Certain elements of it, yes. Elements that are declassifiable under the current circumstances." She hadn't thought about her service record in a long time. Or rather, she'd thought about it in the way you thought about a piece of furniture you'd put in storage. You knew it was there. You knew what it contained. You'd made a deliberate choice not to take it out. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course. I'll be available at this number." A pause. "Ms. Donnelly, Lieutenant Commander Voss wanted me to tell you something." "What?" "He said, and I'm quoting, 'Don't disappear again.'" She was quiet. "I'll be in touch," she said, and ended the call. She put the phone down on the table and looked at her coffee. Don't disappear again. She understood the appeal of what Voss was offering. The coalition of people who had seen what she could do and were now prepared to say it aloud, on the record, in the language of institutions. She understood that it could work, that it might very well work, that the combination of a military liaison and the testimony of decorated SEAL operators in her own declassified file might be enough to stop Greer's incident report in its tracks and replace the narrative he was building with a different one. She understood all of that. What she also understood was that once that door opened, it didn't close again. Once the record came out, once the declassified elements were on the table in some administrative hearing room, she was no longer the invisible woman. She was former Captain Mara Donnelly, and that was a different person with a different set of visibility, and you couldn't put that back in the box. She had put it in the box very deliberately. She picked up her coffee, found it had gone cold, and put it in the microwave. While it heated, her phone rang again. Different number this time. A number she knew. She picked up before the second ring. "I heard," said the voice on the other end. "Calloway," she said. Lieutenant Colonel Denise Calloway, retired technically, though retirement had never quite stuck, had known Mara for 11 years, starting from a training program at a facility she still couldn't name in polite conversation, and she had the distinction of being one of approximately 4 people on Earth who knew both the full extent of Mara's service record and her current Creston Falls address. "Voss called me at 5 in the morning," Calloway said. "You know how much I enjoy that." "How was he?" "Determined," Calloway said, which is his default, so. "He's organized. He's got Webb, he's got Holt, he's got Kowalski's family on standby. The Kowalski kid's father is a judge in Oregon, incidentally, in case that becomes relevant. He wants to fight this through proper channels, and he wants to do it fast before the hospital gets their paperwork in order." Mara sat back down at the table. "And you?" "I want to know what you want," Calloway said, which is a novelty for the men in this particular situation, I realize. "I don't want to lose the job." "You're going to lose the job regardless of what happens. Greer's not going to keep you after this. The question is whether you lose it on his terms or yours." "Those aren't the only options." Calloway was quiet for a moment. Then, "No, you're right. They're not." Another pause. "There are people in this hospital who haven't made up their minds yet. People who saw what you did last night and are sitting with it." "The nurses," Mara said. "Some of them. Sat, from what I understand." "He's apparently been very quiet since midnight, which in resident doctors means either they're sleeping or they're reconsidering something." Mara thought about Sado. Young, genuinely skilled, the specific earnestness of someone who had not yet fully decided what kind of doctor they were going to be. She had seen him watch her work last night with the concentrated attention of someone recording something. "There's also the matter of the incident reports from previous cases," Calloway said. "What about them?" "Voss had someone pull them. The hospital's internal incident reports from the last 8 months. Complaints from nursing staff, near-miss reports, medication discrepancy flags. There's a pattern. Greer's name appears in a notable number of them in a notable way." Mara was still. "What pattern?" "Cases where nursing staff flagged concerns and were documented as having overstepped," Calloway said. "Cases where the flag turned out to be correct. Cases where patients had complications that the initial nursing observations had predicted and Greer had overruled." She paused. 7 cases in 8 months, Mara. 7 documented instances of the same basic dynamic. The number sat in the room like something with weight. 7 cases. She had not been his first, she had not even been his most recent. She had simply been the one who hadn't backed down. Or rather, the one who hadn't had time to back down because the patient was dying in front of her. "He's been doing this for a long time," Mara said. "That's what the reports suggest." "Yes." "And nobody did anything about it." "There were people who tried," Calloway said. "There's at least one nurse, a woman named Lena Farrow, she resigned 6 months ago, who filed a formal complaint against Greer. It was reviewed internally and dismissed. She left the hospital shortly after." Mara had not known Lena Farrow. She had arrived after Farrow's departure. But she thought about her now. Thought about the specific experience of being someone who saw what was happening and said something and was then managed out of the institution, quietly, with all the correct procedural language in place. "What happened to her complaint?" she asked. The review board consisted of 3 administrators and 1 physician. Greer had been on the hospital staff for 14 years. He's brought in significant grant revenue. The complaint was classified as unsupported. Calloway's voice was neutral, which was Calloway's way of expressing controlled anger. "There's documentation of the review. Voss has it." "Of course he does." "He's thorough," Calloway said. "Always was." Mara looked at the window. The sky outside was beginning to lighten slightly, the dark gray of very early morning starting to differentiate itself from the surrounding night. It was going to be a cloudy day. "He wants to use the incident reports," she said, "alongside the service record." "Yes. If they bring in the incident reports, this stops being about me and starts being about Greer." "Also yes. Which means Greer stops being the person processing an administrative review of a nurse who overstepped and becomes the subject of a parallel investigation." "That's the theory," Calloway said. "Whether it works depends on a lot of things, including whether the hospital board has the stomach for a serious reckoning with a department head, or whether they decide the easier move is to let you go quietly and make the incident reports disappear." Mara said nothing. "The military testimony changes the calculus," Calloway said, "significantly. Because it's one thing to let a night shift nurse go without a fight. It's another thing to do it while a Navy lieutenant commander is standing in your administrative office with a file folder." "He'd actually come in person?" "Mara, He was awake at 5 in the morning organizing this. Yes, he'd come in person. She picked up her coffee, remembered it was in the microwave, left it there. I need some time, she said. You have until Monday. That's when Greer's formal report goes to the review board. It's Friday morning. Yes, Calloway said. It is. Mara stood up and walked to the window. 7 blocks away, Bayside General was fully lit, fully staffed, humming along in its morning transition between overnight and day shift. Inside it, Marcus Webb was sleeping in a recovery bed. James Kowalski was breathing through a ventilator they'd probably be able to remove in 12 hours. The second patient, whose name she now knew was Diego Reyes because she'd read the intake board before she left, was in the interventional radiology recovery suite with a spleen that was intact. 3 people alive who might not have been. Calloway, she said. Still here. Here. The nurses he silenced. If this moves forward, is there a way to reach them? A pause. You mean formally? Formally reach them? I mean, if there's a process that lets former staff speak, if there's a mechanism that isn't just a nursing grievance no one reads, I want to know about it. Calloway was quiet for a moment. You're not just protecting yourself, she said. He's going to do it again, Mara said, to someone else. The next person who sees something he doesn't want seen, he'll manage them out the same way. Yes, Calloway said, he will. Then it can't just be about me. Another pause, longer this time. I'll make some calls, Calloway said. Don't do anything today. Sleep if you can. I'll call you back by noon. Calloway. Yeah. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Calloway said, and hung up. Mara put the phone down. She stood at the window for a while. Then she got her coffee from the microwave, sat back down at the table, and drank it, even though it was slightly overheated and tasted faintly of the inside of a microwave, which was not ideal but was also not the most difficult thing she'd dealt with in the last 12 hours. She had been trying for 4 years to be a person who lived on a smaller scale. She had been trying to prove to herself that you could step out of the thing you were trained for and built for and become something quieter, something less visible, something that didn't carry so much weight. Not because the weight was bad, but because carrying it for long enough eventually cost you something you didn't get back. She had watched other people pay that cost. She had come close to paying it herself. She'd come to Creston Falls to stop paying it. But you didn't walk into a trauma bay and watch someone die from something preventable and do nothing. You didn't stand in the corner with your hands folded while the clock ran out and the monitor climbed and the physician in charge hesitated over something you could see clearly and had the skills to address. You didn't do that. She hadn't done it. And now here she was at 5:30 in the morning in her kitchen with coldish coffee and a phone full of calls she hadn't finished processing. And across town, a hospital administration was preparing a review process she was almost certainly going to be on the wrong side of by Monday morning. She thought about Lena Farrow, whoever she was, walking out of Bayside General 6 months ago with a dismissed complaint and nowhere to put it, disappearing into wherever nurses went when institutions failed them. She thought about Webb saying, "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard," with his chest newly stabilized and his voice still rough. And somehow that flat, exhausted assessment was the thing that stayed with her most clearly from the entire night. She thought about Greer's expression when she'd stepped back from Marcus Webb's gurney and the monitor had changed. The look of a man recalibrating not toward gratitude but toward defense. She pulled up the Bayside General HR portal on her phone. She still had access, they hadn't revoked it yet, and navigated to the employee directory. She searched for Lena Farrow. The profile was still in the system, listed as inactive, former staff, departed 6 months prior. But the contact information was still there. An email address. The personal one employees were allowed to list for reference correspondence. Mara looked at it for a long moment. Then she opened her email and started typing. She didn't tell Farrow who she was right away. She introduced herself, explained that she was currently a night shift nurse at Bayside General and that she was in the middle of a situation that might benefit from context, and she asked if Farrow would be willing to speak with her. She sent it. Then she sat back and looked at the lightning window and thought about Monday and what would happen at the review board and whether a single night of doing the right thing in front of the wrong people was going to be enough, and whether it was possible to fight an institution from the inside when you were simultaneously being processed out of it. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. The email had bounced. She stared at it for a moment. The address was no longer active, which happened. People changed their contact information, moved on, didn't maintain old channels. But there was something else. She went back to the HR portal, pulled up Pharaoh's inactive profile, looked at the departure date, looked at the reason code listed in the system. The reason code said voluntary resignation, but below the reason code, in a field that was not normally visible to general staff access, Mara had stumbled into it by navigating through a menu path that was slightly non-standard, something she'd learned doing administrative work at a previous hospital. There was a secondary notation, 3 words. She read them twice. Then she put the phone face down on the table and sat very still. Because the 3 words in the secondary field were NDA terms enforced, which meant Lena Pharaoh hadn't simply resigned. She had been paid to be quiet. And the email address was inactive because someone had made sure there was no contact path left to follow. Mara sat at the kitchen table in the thin early morning light and understood very clearly that what she had walked into at Bayside General was significantly larger and more deliberate than a difficult department head with a bad management style. This had been managed, professionally, over time, which meant somewhere in the institution there were people who knew what Greer was doing and had decided that the cost of addressing it was higher than the cost of containing it. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text. Unknown number, no introduction, just a name and a time. The name was one she didn't recognize. The time was 8 hours from now. And underneath both of those, 4 more words. She wants to talk. Mara stared at the text for a long time. She wants to talk. No signature, no context. Just the name. Renata Osei. And a time. 2 p.m., which was 8 hours away, and which told her nothing about a location, a format, or how whoever had sent this had gotten her personal number in the first place. She turned the phone over, set it face down, picked it back up. She typed back, "Who is this?" 3 minutes passed. Then, "A friend of Lena's. Renata will explain. Corner of Halsey and 9th. The coffee place with the green awning. She'll find you." Mara read it twice and then set the phone down again and went to take a shower because she hadn't slept and she wasn't going to sleep, and she needed to do something that felt like resetting, and standing under hot water for 8 minutes was the closest available option. She stood there with the water hitting the back of her neck and thought about NDAs. Non-disclosure agreements in hospital settings were not unusual. They were standard instruments in legal settlements, used when someone had a legitimate grievance, when an institution had made a mistake, and when both parties decided the fastest path forward was money in exchange for silence. That happened. It was imperfect and often unfair to the complainant, but it was a recognizable transaction. What made Lena Pharaoh's situation different was the secondary notation in the HR system, visible only through a non-standard navigation path, which suggested it had been recorded in a field that was not routinely audited. Someone had documented the NDA not in the primary case file, but in a shadow field, which you did when you wanted a record for internal purposes, but didn't want the record to be findable without specific access. Which meant someone in hospital administration had known exactly what they were doing when they managed Pharaoh out. Not a mistake. Not an oversight. A choice. Mara got out of the shower, dried off, put on the kind of clothes she wore when she wasn't at work, jeans, a gray long-sleeve shirt, her heavier jacket because November in Washington didn't forgive people who underdressed. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her phone. She could call Calloway back and tell her about the text. She should, probably. Calloway would want to know. Calloway would also immediately begin organizing around the information, pulling threads, making calls of her own, and the situation would accelerate in ways Mara couldn't fully predict. She needed to know what Renata Osei had to say before she handed the thread to anyone else. She lay down on top of the covers with her jacket on and closed her eyes. She did not expect to sleep. She slept for 4 hours, which was not enough but was what her body had decided it could take, and she woke up at 10:15 with the specific clarity of someone whose nervous system had done its minimum maintenance and was now back online. She made eggs. She ate them standing at the counter, looking at the wall, which was blank because she had never put anything on it. The apartment had the impersonal quality of somewhere a person lived rather than somewhere a person had made a home, which was a distinction she had stopped apologizing for. At 1:40, she walked out the door. The coffee place on Halsey and 9th was called Groundwork and had a green awning that had seen better decades. Inside it smelled like burnt espresso and wet wool, and every table was occupied by the specific variety of midday patron who worked from laptops and wore headphones and would not look up if the ceiling came down. Mara ordered a black coffee she didn't need and took a table near the back wall, facing the door. At 2:03, a woman came in. Mara had been watching the door, so she saw her the moment she pushed through. Mid-40s maybe, dark-skinned with close-cropped natural hair, and the kind of posture that came from years of staying upright under weight. She was wearing a heavy coat and carrying a canvas bag, and she scanned the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who was used to assessing spaces, and her eyes found Mara and stayed there. She came over and sat down without a greeting. "Renata Osei," she said. "Mara Donnelly." Renata looked at her for a moment with the evaluating quality of someone deciding something. "You found the secondary notation." "Yes." "That field is only accessible through the back-end HR interface. Standard staff access doesn't reach it." "I've worked in hospital administration before," Mara said. "I know how the systems are structured." Renata accepted this with a small nod. She set the canvas bag on the chair beside her and put her hands flat on the table. "I'm going to tell you some things," she said. "Before I do, I need you to understand that I am not a lawyer, I am not a hospital employee, and I am not here in any official capacity." "Understood." "I'm a former patient advocate with the State Health Oversight Board," Renata said. "I left that position 8 months ago. I left because a complaint I was processing was interfered with." Mara was still. "A complaint about Bayside General," she said. "A complaint about patterns of care and outcomes in the emergency department at Bayside General," Renata said. "Specifically, a pattern of nursing staff raising concerns about patient management that were systematically suppressed. I opened a preliminary inquiry. I was building a file." She paused. "The file was flagged. My supervisor called me in and told me the inquiry was outside the scope of standard review protocols. I was told to close it." "Did you?" Renata looked at her steadily. "Officially," she said. Something in Mara settled. "And unofficially." Renata reached into the canvas bag and removed a manila folder. She put it on the table between them. "Lena Farrow is one case," she said. "There are 4 others. Nurses and 1 physician's assistant who were either terminated, pressured to resign, or given NDA settlements between 18 months and 3 years ago. In each case, the individual had raised concerns about patient care under Dr. Russell Greer. In each case, the concern was dismissed internally. In each case, the individual left the hospital within 60 days of raising the concern." Mara looked at the folder but didn't open it yet. "The physician's assistant," she said. "What was the concern?" "Wrong intervention sequence on a cardiac presentation. She flagged it during the case. Greer overruled her. The patient survived, but with complications that extended his hospital stay by 9 days and resulted in long-term cardiac damage." "Was there a malpractice claim?" "The family filed one. It was settled privately." Renata's voice was careful and flat. "The settlement included a clause that prohibited the family from naming the attending physician specifically." Mara absorbed this. "So the settlement money came from the hospital's liability fund, not Greer personally." "Correct." "Which means the hospital paid to protect him." "Which means," Renata said, "that someone with authority in that institution made a decision, on multiple occasions, that the cost of managing the liability was preferable to the cost of addressing the source." The coffee place hummed around them. Espresso machine, laptop keys, the murmur of someone on a phone call 2 tables over. Ordinary sounds, completely disconnected from what was being laid out on this table in a manila folder. Mara opened the folder. The documents inside were organized. Dates, names, case summaries, HR action codes, settlement figures with the specific amounts redacted but the category designations intact. Renata had been thorough. She'd been doing this for a long time. "Why are you giving this to me?" Mara asked. "Because you're still inside the process," Renata said. "I'm outside it. The file I have is compelling, but it's built on unofficial documentation and former employee accounts, most of whom are bound by NDAs that limit what they can say and in what context. You were on active staff when the incident occurred. What happened last night was witnessed by identifiable people, including military personnel whose accounts carry significant institutional weight. You need an inside case." "I need a case that opens a formal channel," Renata said. "What happened to those 5 people? What they tried to report? what was done to them afterward. That doesn't get reviewed in any meaningful way unless someone inside the hospital forces the door open from the inside. Mara looked at her. You've been waiting for this. Renata didn't look away. I've been watching the hospital's incident record for 8 months, waiting for something that was too visible to contain. Something that happened in front of too many people with too much credibility. She paused. Last night was that something. Mara sat with that. It was a clean theory, it was also true, which was the more unsettling part. She had not walked into the trauma bay intending to become anyone's lever. She had walked in because a man was dying and she knew how to stop it, but the effect was the same either way. The Monday Review Board, she said. Greer's incident report against me. What's the composition of that board? 3 administrators and 2 physicians, Renata said. Standard disciplinary review format. Who are the physicians? Dr. Frank Aldis, Chief of Internal Medicine, and Dr. Susan Park, who chairs the Quality Assurance Committee. Mara knew Aldis by reputation, careful, institutional, the kind of doctor who made good decisions slowly. She had crossed paths with Park twice during her 7 months, briefly, and had the impression of someone who was genuinely rigorous about process. If the incident reports were placed in front of the board alongside Greer's report, not just mine, but the documented pattern across multiple staff members, would the board have the authority, Renata said. Whether they'd use it is a different question. It depends on whether the administration has insulated Greer at the board level or whether the board has independent standing to act. Can you find that out? Renata looked at her for a moment. I can try. I also need to know about the settlement approvals, Mara said. The NDA settlements for Faro and the others. Who in the administration signed off on those? Why does that matter? Because if a senior administrator authorized those settlements with full knowledge of the pattern, if they knew what they were suppressing and paid to suppress it, that's not institutional negligence. That's active concealment of a patient safety issue. Mara kept her voice even. That changes what the board is looking at. It stops being a review of my actions and becomes a governance failure at the executive level. Renata was quiet for a moment. That's a significant escalation, she said. Yes, Mara said. If you push at the executive level, the institution's first response is going to be defense, not reform. They will make this about you. They will go after your record, your qualifications, anything they can use to make the story about your credibility rather than their conduct. I know. And you're willing to do this anyway. Mara picked up her coffee. 7 people, she said. At minimum. Probably more, who tried to do the right thing and got paid off or pushed out and had to start over somewhere else, with a non-disclosure they couldn't talk around, carrying the knowledge that the pattern was still going on behind them. She drank the coffee. It was mediocre. Yeah, she said, I'm willing. Renata looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was not quite admiration, but was something in that neighborhood. The look of someone who had spent a long time working towards something and had just found an unexpected point of traction. I need you to hold off on going to the board directly until I can determine the composition question, Renata said. Give me until Sunday evening. The formal report goes to the board Monday morning. I know, Sunday evening. Mara nodded. Renata picked up the manila folder and slid it back into her bag. I'll make a copy for you, she said. The copy I give you will have my contact information removed. If you're asked where you obtained it, you received it anonymously. Can you work with that? Yes. There's one more thing. Renata set the bag down and looked at her directly. One of the nurses who was pressured out, a man named Ben Taggart, he left the hospital 14 months ago. He didn't sign an NDA. Mara went still. Why not? Because they didn't offer him one. His situation was handled differently. They used a different mechanism. A formal performance review process that built a paper record of deficiencies over 3 months and then terminated him for cause. Renata's jaw tightened slightly. Which means there was no cash settlement to buy his silence. Which means he can talk. He can talk, Renata confirmed, and he's been waiting 14 months for someone to ask him to. Mara set her coffee down. Where is he? Still in Creston Falls, Renata said. He took a position at a clinic on the east side. He's been there since he left Bayside. She paused. I've already spoken to him. This morning, after I reached out to you, he wants to meet you. When? He said whenever you're ready. Mara looked at the green awning through the front window of the coffee place. A woman walked by outside pushing a stroller, her head down against the November wind. A delivery van double parked on the corner, hazards flashing. Ordinary afternoon, ordinary street. "Tell him tomorrow morning," she said. She walked back to her apartment in the cold and sat down at the kitchen table and called Calloway. She told her about Renata Osei, the 5 cases, the NDA documentation, Ben Taggart. She did not tell her about the executive-level settlement approval question yet. That needed more information before she handed it to Calloway, who would immediately begin pulling institutional threads in ways Mara wanted to sequence carefully. Calloway listened without interrupting, which was notable because Calloway almost always interrupted. When Mara finished, there was a pause. "You've been awake for what, 30 hours?" Calloway said. "Something like that. And you met a former state oversight official at a coffee shop in the middle of all this." "She had information I needed." "Mara." Calloway's voice shifted, losing some of its tactical quality and becoming something closer to personal. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." "Okay. Are you doing this because you want to fix the hospital, or because it's the first thing in 4 years that's made you feel like yourself?" The question landed cleanly. Mara sat with it without reflexive deflection. "Both," she said. "That's honest," Calloway said. "Is it a problem?" "Only if you let the second one make you reckless about the first." A pause. "Don't get out ahead of your evidence. You know better than that." "I know." "The Taggart meeting tomorrow. I want to send someone." "No," Mara said. "I meet him alone first. If he's credible, I'll tell you." Calloway made a sound that was not quite agreement, but was not refusal either. "Voss is going to be at the hospital Monday morning." "In what capacity?" "He's petitioned for the right to submit a formal statement to the review board. As a party with direct knowledge of the incidents in question, the hospital's legal office is reviewing whether to admit it. Can they deny it?" "Technically, they can decline to include it in the board's materials," Calloway said. "But doing so while a Navy lieutenant commander is standing in the building requesting admission is a different calculation than a routine denial." "The legal office is going to try to find a way to contain it," Mara said. "Make it an informal statement. Limit its scope." "Probably." "Then we need the incident reports in front of the board before the legal office has time to frame Voss's statement as peripheral. If the board sees the pattern first, Voss's statement becomes corroborating rather than primary, which is actually a stronger position because it means the case doesn't rest on the testimony of one outside party." Calloway was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about this." "I've had nothing else to do since 4 in the morning." "All right," Calloway said. "I'll talk to Everett. We'll figure out the sequencing." Another pause. "Get some sleep tonight. Actually sleep. Whatever you're about to walk into Monday needs you functional." "I'll sleep." "You won't," Calloway said, "but I appreciate the attempt." She hung up. Mara sat at the kitchen table until the light outside shifted from afternoon to early evening. She reviewed what she had and what she didn't. She had a pattern of documented suppressions and a former oversight official who had been building a case for 8 months. She had the incident reports Voss had pulled. She had a man named Ben Taggart who could speak without an NDA constraint. She had a lieutenant commander willing to submit formal testimony. She had the facts of what she'd done in the trauma bay, the outcome of what she'd done, and the medical documentation that supported both. What she didn't have was any certainty about the board. Renata's question, whether the administration had insulated Greer at the board level, was the variable she couldn't read. If the same administrative instinct that had signed off on NDA settlements had also structured the board's composition to protect its interests, then all of the evidence she was building could land in a room predisposed to dismiss it. She needed to know who had signed those settlements. She opened her laptop and began working through what was publicly accessible: hospital annual reports, state health authority filings, board of directors meeting minutes from Bayside General's website, which were available for the last 3 years and recorded in the specific banal language of institutional governance. She read them with the patience of someone who knew that the thing you were looking for was rarely labeled. She found it at 11:42 at night, in a board minutes document from 22 months ago. A line item in the consent calendar, the portion of board minutes where routine business was approved en masse without individual discussion, noting the authorization of a legal settlement in the category of employment and personnel matters, approved by signature of the Chief Operating Officer, a man named Gerald Pratt, under a standing delegation of authority for settlements below a specific dollar threshold. She checked the date. 22 months ago was 3 months after Lena Farrow had filed her complaint. She pulled up the next year's board minutes, found another consent calendar entry. Similar language. Different date. 6 months after the physician's assistant had raised her concerns about the cardiac case. Gerald Pratt's signature, both times. Gerald Pratt, who is currently the chief operating officer of Bayside General, who reported to the hospital's board of directors, who had, twice at minimum, authorized payments to silence people who had tried to report a pattern of dangerous care under Russell Greer. Mara closed the laptop. She sat in the quiet apartment and looked at the dark window and let the full weight of what she'd found settle. This was the thing Renata had been building toward. This was why she'd kept the file unofficial, why she'd waited for an inside case, why the board composition question mattered. Because if Pratt had structural influence over the board, then the Monday review was not an impartial process. It was a managed one. She picked up her phone and started typing a message to Renata. Then she stopped. She thought about the sequencing. If she sent this to Renata tonight, Renata would contact her own network, and by tomorrow morning there would be people moving on this information. That was fast. And fast was sometimes exactly what you needed, and sometimes fast was what got you killed in a different sense. The sense of moving before you'd secured enough of the position to hold it against the response. She needed Taggart first. She needed his account, unencumbered by NDA, on the record with someone who could present it Monday. She needed that before Pratt had any reason to believe the scope of what was coming at him. Because once Pratt knew the settlement trail had been found, the first thing he would do was talk to the board members he had influence over. And the second thing he would do was talk to the hospital's lawyers. And by the time Monday arrived, the room would be arranged very differently than it was right now. She would talk to Taggart tomorrow morning, get his account. Then she would tell Renata about Pratt. Then she would tell Calloway and let Calloway and Voss and Everett figure out the presentation strategy for the board. She set the phone down. She lay down in her clothes again and closed her eyes. She was asleep within 7 minutes. Ben Taggart was 43 and had the compact, slightly compressed quality of a person who had been dealing with something heavy for a long time without complaint. He met her at a diner 2 blocks from the East Side clinic where he now worked, ordered coffee and a piece of toast that he didn't eat, and looked at Mara across the table with the specific expression of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say and was now, in the moment, deciding whether to say it differently. "I heard what happened Thursday night," he said. "How?" "One of the overnight techs at Bayside is my neighbor," he said. "She texted me at 6 in the morning. Told me a nurse saved 2 soldiers and Greer was getting her fired." He looked at his coffee. "I knew it would happen eventually. Someone seeing something, not being able to stop themselves from acting." He looked up. "I just didn't know who it would be." "Tell me about your case," Mara said. He told her. It took 40 minutes. He was precise, not rehearsed in a coached way, but in the way of someone who had gone over the facts so many times in their own head that the sequence had worn smooth grooves. A patient presenting with septic presentation that Taggart had flagged as deteriorating faster than the primary treatment plan accounted for. His recommendation for escalated intervention. Greer's response, which was to document Taggart's flag as nursing overreach and proceed with the original plan. The patient's condition worsening over the next 4 hours. A secondary crisis that required intensive response. A patient who survived but had an extended recovery that the attending's notes, Taggart said, had attributed to the underlying infection rather than to any delay in escalation. And then the 3 months of performance reviews, written up for minor infractions that had never been issues before. Response times questioned. Documentation characterized as incomplete. A paper record built brick by brick into something that looked like a performance problem rather than what it actually was. "Did you talk to anyone?" Mara asked. "During those 3 months?" "I talked to Nina Ashby," he said. Mara went still. "What did she say?" Ben Taggart wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "She said she would look into it. She said the performance review process was standard and that I should continue to respond through proper channels." He looked at the table. The termination came 6 weeks later. Nina Ashby. The same Nina Ashby who had come to the trauma bay Thursday night with Greer and told Mara she was being placed on administrative leave. The same Nina Ashby who had looked at her with that evaluating expression and said, "Is there anything you'd like to tell me right now?" Ashby knew, Mara said. "She knew," Taggart said. Whether she knew the full scope of it, I can't prove. But she knew the pattern. She chose the same response both times. Mara sat with this for a moment. The architecture of it was becoming clearer and also more uncomfortable. Greer at the center, Pratt authorizing the financial management of the problem. Ashby managing the institutional response, steering complaints into processes designed to dissolve them. Not one person's failure. A system. Ben, she said, would you be willing to submit a written account of your case to the hospital board's review on Monday? He looked at her. Yes, he said, without hesitating. It might get contested. They'll probably say your account is biased because of the termination. Let them say it, he said. The patient's records are in the system. My documentation from those weeks is in the system. The timeline is in the system. I know exactly where to look because I spent 14 months thinking about what I'd say if anyone ever asked. He paused. No one ever asked. I'm asking, Mara said. He nodded slowly. I'll write it today. She drove back to her apartment and called Renata. She told her about Gerald Pratt and the consent calendar entries. Renata was quiet for so long after she finished that Mara checked twice to make sure the call was still connected. That's the thing I couldn't find, Renata said finally. I knew the settlements existed. I couldn't locate the signature authority. It's in the board minutes, Mara said. Consent calendar, 22 months ago and again 16 months ago. The consent calendar, Renata said, the tone of someone recognizing the exact place a thing had been hidden. No one reads the consent calendar. I know. This changes the board question significantly, Renata said. If Pratt has been directing hush settlements, the board members who are close to Pratt have a direct conflict of interest in reviewing anything that might expose the settlement pattern. Her voice was moving faster now. The pace of someone whose thinking had accelerated. We need to know which board members have a conflict before Monday. Yes. And if Ashby was managing the institutional response on the ground, that implicates her in Monday's review directly. She initiated the leave action against you. If she's part of the pattern we're alleging, her role in initiating that action is itself evidence of continuation of the pattern. Yes, Mara said again, which is why I think the Monday review needs to be challenged before it begins, not at the board level, above it. Silence. The State Health Authority, Renata said quietly. You still have contacts there. I left under difficult circumstances. You also have 8 months of documentation of a patient safety pattern and a former oversight inquiry that was interfered with, Mara said, which is itself a reportable event. Renata was quiet again. If I file a complaint with the State Health Authority before Monday, she said slowly, it triggers a mandatory hold on any internal disciplinary actions that relate to the subject matter of the complaint, which means the board review would be suspended pending the external inquiry. Pending their determination of scope. Yes. A pause. That's not guaranteed. The authority's intake process can take days. Can you reach someone directly? There is one person, Renata said. I'd have to call in something I've been holding on to for a while. Would you? The pause was long enough that Mara didn't fill it. Yes, Renata said finally. Yes, I would. I'll have a Taggart's written account to you tonight, Mara said, and I'll send you the board minutes. Mara, Renata's voice changed slightly. You understand that once I file this, it becomes official. The hospital will know within hours. They will respond. I know. Pratt will know. I know. He will try to get ahead of it. He'll try, Mara said. But he's been managing this problem quietly for 22 months by making individuals disappear. He doesn't have a playbook for it being loud. She ended the call. She sat for a moment and thought about the specific kind of clarity that came with commitment. Not comfort, not certainty, just the clean feeling of having made a decision you couldn't walk back from, and being at peace with that because you had examined it from all available angles and still arrived at the same conclusion. She had been trying to stay invisible. Staying invisible was no longer available. She opened her laptop and began drafting the document she would need for Monday. A comprehensive factual account of Thursday night's events, with supporting clinical logic for each intervention, cross-reference to her training background in a way that was factual without being self-promotional. She wrote it the way she had written operational reports in a different life, precise, sequential, without editorializing, letting the facts do the work that emotion would do badly. She was 40 minutes into it when her phone rang. Not Calloway. Not Renata. Not a number she recognized. She answered anyway. Ms. Donnelly. The voice was male, careful, the specific cadence of a man choosing each word with awareness of how it would land. My name is Gerald Pratt. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Bayside General. Mara's hand on the phone was completely still. Mr. Pratt, she said. I understand you've had a difficult few days, Pratt said, and I wanted to reach out personally. I think there may have been some miscommunication about the nature of the review process. I want you to know that the hospital's intention is absolutely to ensure this is handled fairly. I appreciate that, she said. I was also hoping we might have a conversation, he said, informally, before Monday. I think there's an opportunity here to resolve this in a way that works for everyone. Mara looked at the laptop screen in front of her, the document she'd been writing, the facts laid out in clean paragraphs. What kind of resolution? She said. Well, Pratt said, and his voice shifted very slightly, the shift of a man who had moved past the introductory preamble and was now saying what he had actually called to say, I think with the right framing, we could structure a departure package for you that recognized your contributions and allowed you to move forward with your record intact. A clean separation, no findings, no formal review documentation. Mara was quiet. In exchange for what? She said. Just a mutual agreement to resolve this privately, he said, without further escalation. I think that's the cleanest path forward for everyone involved. She understood what he was saying perfectly. He was offering her the same package he had offered Lena Farrow and the others. Money, a clean record, and a non-disclosure that would require her to stop doing what she had spent the weekend setting in motion. He was offering it on a Saturday evening, 2 days before the review, which meant someone had told him the situation was moving in a direction he had not anticipated, which meant one of two things. Either Renata's contact at the state health authority had already begun making calls, or Voss's petition to the review board had surfaced information that Pratt had now been briefed on. Either way, he was trying to close the door she had opened. She looked at the laptop screen. She thought about Ben Taggart's face across the table at the diner. The piece of toast he hadn't eaten. 14 months of waiting for someone to ask. Mr. Pratt, she said, I'm going to have to decline. A pause. The first pause he'd allowed himself. Ms. Donnelly, I think if you consider... I've considered, she said. I'll see the board on Monday. She ended the call. Her phone rang again immediately. She looked at the screen. Pratt again. She let it ring and turned back to her laptop and kept writing. 2 minutes later, a text came in from Calloway. Heads up. Hospital's legal office just contacted Everett. They're trying to block Voss's board statement as outside the scope of the review. Everett is pushing back. It's going to go to the board chair tonight. Mara read it and typed back. Pratt just called me. Offered a settlement. Calloway's response came in 4 seconds. He's scared. That's good. Don't sign anything. I didn't. I know you didn't. I'm saying for later. Don't sign anything. Mara put the phone down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she looked back at the laptop and typed the next sentence of her account. She was still typing at 11 p.m. when another text came in, this one from a number she'd stored under Renata's name. Filed. State Health Authority intake confirmed. Formal complaint received. Review process initiates Monday. Mara read it twice, and then a second text 30 seconds later from the same number. There's a problem. The board chair at Bayside, the person who would normally receive the hold notification, is a man named Warren Okafor. He's been on the board for 11 years. A pause. Then the third text. Warren Okafor and Gerald Pratt were college roommates. I just found it. They've been connected for 30 years. Mara stared at the screen. She typed, Does that compromise the hold? Renata's response came in a minute later. Not legally. The hold is automatic on complaint filing, but it means the person who receives the notification is going to call Pratt the moment it lands. How long until it lands? 8 to 12 hours, Monday morning, which meant that by the time Mara walked into the review board on Monday morning, Pratt would have had a phone call with the board chair. The board chair would have had the weekend to respond, and the room she was walking into would not be the room she had been preparing for. She set the phone down. Thought. 7 minutes later, she picked it up and called Voss. He answered on the second ring, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. I need to move the timeline, she said. How? Can you get to the hospital tonight? A beat. Yes. How many of your people are still in Creston Falls? All of them, he said. Webb discharged himself this afternoon. Against medical advice, technically, but his vitals were solid and he was arguing with everyone in range. That sounded right. I need all of you at the hospital tomorrow morning, she said. 7 a.m., not to confront anyone, not to pressure anyone, but I need you there and I need it to be visible. Why tomorrow? Voss said. The review is Monday. Because Monday the room is compromised, she said. I need to put something in front of the people who can still be reached before Pratt gets to them first. And I need to do it when the hospital administration isn't expecting it. Silence on the line. Then, 7 a.m., Voss said. 7 a.m. We'll be there. She put the phone down, looked at the laptop, looked at the window, where outside the night had fully settled over Creston Falls, dark and still, and carrying the cold weight of late November. Tomorrow was Sunday. The hospital would be running on a lighter administrative staff. The board members who lived locally would be at home with their families. Or not. It was a Sunday, and people had varying relationships with their weekends. She needed to reach Dr. Susan Park. Park, who chaired the Quality Assurance Committee. Park, who she had crossed paths with twice, and whose manner had suggested someone who took the process seriously rather than instrumentally. If Park was reachable before Pratt made his call to Okafor, if Park saw the incident reports in Taggart's account and the consent calendar entries before the board chair briefed the room against her, it might shift the composition. It might not. But it was the move available to her. She searched the hospital directory for Park's contact information. She found a department email, which was no help, and then she pulled up a professional listing on a medical network site and found a secondary contact used for academic correspondence, which was slightly more promising. She wrote the email carefully. Not an appeal, not an argument, just a factual note explaining that she was the nurse whose case would be reviewed Monday, that there was information relevant to the board's deliberation that she believed needed to be in front of the committee before the review began, and that she was available to speak if Park had any interest in receiving that information. She sent it at 11:47 p.m. She did not expect a response until morning. Her phone lit up at 12:22 a.m. It was not Park. It was an unknown number she had never seen before. She stared at it, picked up. Ms. Donnelly. The voice was female, flat, professional, with the specific affect of someone relaying information rather than initiating a conversation. I'm calling on behalf of Gerald Pratt. Mr. Pratt would like you to know that he has retained outside legal counsel who will be present at Monday's review, and that the scope of the review has been formally expanded to include— It's past midnight, Mara said. A pause. I understand. Mr. Pratt felt it was important to tell Mr. Pratt that whatever he's about to say, he should say it in front of the board. She hung up. Her hands were still. She thought, outside legal counsel. That was new. Pratt bringing lawyers to a nursing disciplinary review was a level of institutional firepower that told her something important. He wasn't trying to manage her quietly anymore. He was preparing to fight, which meant the state health authority filing had already reached him, which meant the 8 to 12 hours Renata had estimated was wrong, which meant the call to Okafor had already happened. She sat very still for several seconds. Then she picked up her phone and typed a message to Calloway. He has outside lawyers. It's already moving. Calloway's response came back faster than it should have, given the hour. I know. Everett called me 20 minutes ago. The legal office at Bayside is trying to reframe the scope of the Monday review. To what? A pause. Then Calloway's message came through. They want to expand it from a review of your actions to a formal fitness for duty hearing. Mara read the message twice. Fitness for duty. That was a different instrument entirely. A fitness for duty hearing had broader powers, broader documentation requirements, and the ability to request access to records beyond the hospital's internal file, including, theoretically, her full employment and training history. Her full history. The parts that weren't on file at Bayside General. The parts that were classified. She put the phone down, sat in the quiet of the apartment and understood very clearly what Pratt had just done. He was not trying to fire a nurse who had overstepped her scope. He was trying to open the sealed file. He was trying to open the sealed file, and if he succeeded, he wouldn't find what he was expecting. That was the thing Pratt didn't know yet. He was gambling on the file being damaging. on it containing something that would make her look unstable, unqualified, or falsely credentialed. He was gambling that a nurse who had spent 7 months being invisible had something to hide. He was right that she had something to hide. He was wrong about what it was. Mara sat at the kitchen table and worked through the implications methodically, the way she had learned to work through problems in environments where a wrong assumption cost lives rather than paperwork. If Pratt's legal team requested access to her full employment and training history through the fitness for duty process, the request would go through the hospital's legal office and then through the appropriate channels depending on the nature of the records. Standard employment history, prior hospitals, nursing licenses, continuing education, was accessible and clean. Nothing there gave him what he wanted. The military records were a different matter. Most of them were classified at a level that a hospital's outside counsel had no mechanism to access. A fitness for duty hearing convened by a private institution had no subpoena power over classified government records. Pratt's lawyers could request them. The request would be declined. And the declination itself, the confirmation that the records existed but were inaccessible to civilian review, would tell the room something without telling them anything specific, which was, she understood, the actual play. He didn't need to open the file. He needed to point at the file and suggest it contained something that warranted concern. In a room that was already disposed toward defending its COO, that suggestion might be enough to muddy the water around her credibility sufficiently to redirect the story. She needed to get ahead of it. She called Voss at 1:15 in the morning without apologizing for the hour because he had already established he wasn't sleeping. Pratt is going to try to request my full record through a fitness for duty expansion, she said when he answered. He can't access the classified material, but he can imply it's problematic. I need someone to clarify what's in it before he gets to suggest what might be. Declassification is a process, Voss said. I know. I'm not asking for full declassification. I'm asking whether there are elements that could be released under a limited disclosure, enough to establish the nature of my training and qualifications without opening everything. Silence on the line. That's a conversation for Everett, Voss said. Can you get him on the phone tonight? Another pause. It's 1 in the morning. I know what time it is. She heard him exhale. Then, give me 20 minutes. She spent those 20 minutes finishing her written account of Thursday night's events. She printed it on the small printer she kept in the closet for the occasional document she needed in physical form. And she read through it once, correcting 2 places where her phrasing had been more defensive than factual. Defensive language was a tell. Facts didn't need defending. Voss called back in 18 minutes. Everett says a limited disclosure is possible under a specific provision. There's a mechanism for releasing training and qualification records to support legal proceedings without declassifying operational content. He'd need authorization from the relevant command. He said he can make that call in the morning. The morning needs to be early, Mara said. He knows. He's already drafting the request. If the disclosure comes through before Monday, it needs to be in front of the board before Pratt's lawyers get to frame what's in it. Everett understands, Voss said. He's done this before. A pause. Mara, what does it say? The qualification record. She thought about how to answer that. It says I'm not a nurse who overstepped her scope, she said. It says the scope I was working in Thursday night is the scope I was trained for, at a level that most physicians in that trauma bay have not been trained to. The line was quiet for a moment. All right, Voss said. Get some sleep. Tomorrow at 7. She slept 4 hours. It was becoming a pattern. Sunday morning at Bayside General had the particular quality of institutional rest. Not empty, never truly empty in a hospital, but slower, staffed differently, with the administrative corridors quieter, and the sense that the building's decision-making apparatus was running on reduced power. The emergency department was active because it was always active, but the offices were dim, the boardroom was empty, and the parking lot had gaps in it that the weekday didn't allow. Mara arrived at 6:50. She had not been formally prohibited from the premises. Her administrative leave covered her clinical duties, not her presence as a private individual engaging with a process that affected her. She had confirmed this interpretation with a healthcare employment attorney she had reached by phone at 8 the previous evening, who had agreed it was correct and had also agreed, after hearing a summary of the situation, to be present Monday morning. The attorney's name was Patricia Obi. She was sharp, direct, and had a specialty in healthcare employment law that Callaway had located through a contact at the State Nursing Association. She had listened to Mara's account with the concentrated attention of someone identifying the architecture of a case, and at the end she had said, "This is not a disciplinary review. This is an institutional self-protection action. They're different things, and I'll make sure the board knows that." Mara had paid her retainer on a credit card she rarely used and felt the particular vertigo of committing to something she couldn't take back. Voss and his team arrived at 7:02. There were 5 of them: Voss, Holt, Webb, Kowalski, who was moving carefully but moving, and a 4th man named Darius Wynn, who had been the least injured of the Thursday group and had the compact, organized quality of someone who managed details. They wore civilian clothes, which was a choice. They had discussed it with Mara the night before. Uniforms would read as pressure. Civilian clothes plus the specific bearing that military discipline imprinted on a person's posture and movement were sufficient to communicate everything the situation needed communicated, without the optics of military personnel arriving in formation to influence a civilian institutional process. They met Mara in the main lobby. Webb looked better than he had any right to look 48 hours after a tension pneumothorax. He was pale and moved with the careful conservation of someone whose chest still ached with every breath. But his eyes were clear and his expression carried the particular focused quality of a man who had a purpose. "You look terrible," Mara told him. "You should see the other guy," he said, "by which I mean my own X-ray." She almost smiled. She led them to the family consultation room on the 2nd floor, which she knew from experience was rarely used on Sunday mornings, and had a table large enough for everyone to spread out. She had called ahead to the weekend charge nurse, who was a woman named Greta Simmons she had a reasonable working relationship with, and Greta had confirmed the room was available and had asked no questions that Mara could not answer simply. They sat down and Mara walked them through the sequence of what she needed from the next 18 hours. Taggart's written account had arrived in her email at 11 the previous night. Thorough, factual, 14 months of clarity, distilled into 4 pages that read like what it was. A man who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. She had forwarded it to Patricia Obi and to Renata. Renata had confirmed just before midnight that the State Health Authority complaint was formally received and logged. The mandatory notification to the hospital would go out with Monday morning's administrative communications, which meant by 8 a.m., Monday, the hospital's legal office would know they were operating under an external inquiry, which further meant that any action taken by the board in Monday's review would occur in the shadow of that inquiry. Reviewable, on the record, accountable in a way that internal processes were not. What Mara needed now was for the board members who were reachable to have the factual picture before Pratt and Okafor finished constructing a different one. She had sent the email to Susan Park the night before. No response yet. At 7:41, her phone buzzed. It was Park. "Ms. Donnelly, I received your message. I'd like to speak with you this morning, if that's possible. I can be at the hospital by 9. Please let me know." Mara read the message and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not relief exactly, but the first indication that the room might not be fully sealed against her. She typed back, "9 works. Thank you," she told the group. Voss nodded once. Holt said nothing. Webb looked at the table with the expression of a man who was exercising significant patience. "You should all stay out of it when she arrives," Mara said. "She needs to form her own view. If she walks in and sees a group of military operators sitting at a table, it changes the dynamic." "You want us to leave," Holt said. "I want you to be somewhere else in the building where I can find you quickly," she said. "There's a family waiting room on the ground floor near the east wing. It has a coffee machine." "How good is the coffee machine?" Webb asked. "It's a hospital coffee machine," she said. "So terrible." "Yes." They moved downstairs at 8:30, and Mara sat alone in the consultation room and read through her written account one more time and did not change anything. Susan Park arrived at 9:04. She was 51, Korean-American, with reading glasses similar to Ashby's but worn differently. On her face rather than on a chain, which was a small thing that said something about how she used them. She came in, closed the door, sat down across from Mara, and looked at her with the direct attention of someone who had already decided to take this seriously and was now determining how seriously. "Tell me what you believe the board doesn't know," Park said. So Mara told her. She took 40 minutes. She was factual. She presented the clinical events of Thursday night with the same precision she had written into her account, and then she laid out the pattern: Taggart, Farrow, The other four, the NDA settlements, the consent calendar entries with Pratt's name, the secondary HR notation, the state health authority complaint that had now been filed. She presented it in the order that made the architecture clear rather than the order that was most emotionally impactful, because Park was a quality assurance physician and responded to systems, not stories. Park did not interrupt. She made notes on a small pad she'd brought. Her expression was controlled throughout, and twice it tightened in a way that Mara recognized. The specific expression of someone encountering information that confirmed a suspicion they hadn't been able to substantiate. When Mara finished, Park set down her pen. "The consent calendar entries," she said. "You have documentation. Copies of the publicly available board minutes. And Taggart's account. Written. Submitted to the State Health Authority inquiry and available to the board." Park looked at the table for a moment. "I've been on this board's quality committee for 4 years," she said. "I have had concerns about the emergency department's outcome metrics for approximately 18 months. I submitted a formal request for a focused review 8 months ago." Mara waited. "The request was tabled," Park said. "The reason given was resource constraints. The chair at the time was Warren Okafor." The name settled in the room. "Okafor is still chair," Mara said. "Yes." "He and Pratt have a 30-year personal relationship." Park's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "I wasn't aware of that." "Renata Osei documented it. She's the former state oversight official who filed yesterday's complaint." Park picked up her pen and wrote something. Then she set it down and looked at Mara directly. "Miss Donnelly, what you've put together here is significant, but I want you to understand what Monday looks like even with this information. Okafor has procedural authority over the meeting. Pratt's lawyers will have standing. The board members who are close to Pratt will follow his lead unless there is something that forces them to respond to the external record rather than the internal narrative." "What would force that?" Mara said. Park looked at her steadily. "If the military testimony is admitted, not as a peripheral statement, but as substantive testimony from parties with direct knowledge of the clinical events, it changes the evidentiary weight of the room. Combined with the health authority complaint and the pattern documentation, the board members who want to do the right thing have covered a break from Okafor. Voss's statement is being blocked by the legal office." "I know," Park said. "I also sit on the Medical Executive Committee, which has concurrent jurisdiction over clinical quality matters. If I convene an emergency session of that committee this afternoon, the military testimony can be admitted into that process rather than the disciplinary review. The two processes run in parallel. The board can't block what goes into the Medical Executive Committee's record." Mara looked at her. "Would you do that?" she said. Park picked up her pen and wrote something else. "I've been trying to get a focused review of that emergency department for 18 months, she said. "Yes, I'll do it." She left at 10:20. Mara sat in the empty consultation room for a moment and breathed. Then she went downstairs to find the others and tell them what was happening. And then she spent the rest of Sunday in a sequence of phone calls and document transfers that she would later remember as one long continuous conversation with only the voices changing. Obi and Renata coordinating on the health authority filing. Everett and Voss working on the limited disclosure of her qualification records, which came through at 2:15 in the afternoon as a 3-page summary document that had been authorized by a command office she recognized and that laid out, in unclassified terms, the nature of her training. Field surgical assistance, advanced trauma management, forward operating base emergency medicine, certified to perform specific interventions under austere conditions that included but were not limited to needle decompression, emergency airway management, and hemorrhage control. The document did not name specific operations. It did not identify units or locations. What it established, in clean factual language, was that the interventions she had performed Thursday night were not a nurse exceeding her scope out of recklessness or overconfidence. They were a trained specialist operating precisely within her actual qualifications, in an environment where those qualifications happened not to be reflected in her current license category. She read it through twice and handed it to Patricia Obi. "This," Obi said, and looked up at her, "is going to be interesting." Monday morning arrived the way important mornings arrived, not with any particular drama in the weather or the light, just an ordinary Pacific Northwest November day, overcast and cold, the kind that made everything look like it was waiting. Mara arrived at Bayside General at 7:45. She wore the same navy clothes she would have worn to a shift. Not a suit, not an attempt to look like something other than what she was. She was a nurse. She had been a nurse here for 7 months. She was going to stand in front of a board as exactly that and let the record do the rest. Patricia Obi met her in the lobby. Obi had dressed for a different kind of room. Sharp, dark, professional. The specific armor of a healthcare employment attorney who had been in rooms like this one before and knew what they required. The health authority notification hit the hospital's legal office at 8:02 this morning, Obi said without preamble. I'm told Pratt arrived at the building at 7:15. He got here before us, Mara said. He did, Obi said, which means he spent 45 minutes talking to Okafor. Then we'd better not wait. They went upstairs. The boardroom was on the 3rd floor, a room that Mara had never been in, with a long table and the specific institutional neutrality of a space designed to look authoritative without expressing any particular opinion. The board members were already seated, 5 of them, as expected. Okafor at the head, a silver-haired man in his 60s with the practiced calm of someone who had been running meetings for a long time. The 2 physicians Renata had identified. 2 administrators Mara didn't know by name. Pratt's outside counsel was present. 2 attorneys, one of whom was already arranging documents on the table with the efficiency of people who had arrived early and intended to use the setup time strategically. Greer was present, seated to one side, with the specific controlled expression of a man who had convinced himself that the outcome of today was not in question. Ashby was present. She looked at Mara when she came in and looked away. Mara sat down beside Obi and looked at the table and did not look at Greer. Okafor opened the meeting at 8:15 with the standard procedural language of a formal review, and Pratt's lead attorney, a man named Morris, mid-50s, the kind of efficient that came from doing this professionally, immediately raised the matter of the fitness for duty expansion, presenting it as a necessary expansion of scope, given what he characterized as significant questions about the respondent's qualifications and background. Obi was on her feet before he finished the sentence. The fitness for duty expansion requires 48 hours notice to the respondent under state healthcare employment regulations, she said. This is the first we're hearing of it. The expansion request is procedurally invalid as of this moment. Morris looked at her. The notice was communicated Saturday night. A phone call at midnight from a representative acting on Mr. Pratt's behalf is not formal notice, Obi said. I can pull the regulation if the board needs it in front of them. She didn't pull the regulation. She didn't need to. Park, seated among the board members, said, She's correct. The expansion requires written notice under a specific provision. I'd like the legal office to confirm before we proceed on that basis. The legal office, represented by a young attorney near the wall who looked like she would have preferred to be anywhere else, confirmed, after a brief consultation on her phone, that Obi's reading was correct. The fitness for duty expansion was off the table. Pratt, seated at the far end near the wall in his capacity as a party to the proceedings, did not visibly react. His attorney made a note. The review proceeded on its original terms. The clinical events of Thursday night, Mara's interventions, the question of scope of practice. Obi presented the qualification disclosure document first. She walked the board through it methodically. The nature of the training, what it authorized, why the interventions on Thursday night were consistent with it. She presented it without drama, in the same factual register that the document itself used, and she let the board read it before continuing. Okafor looked at it for a long time. This is a military training document, he said. Ms. Donnelly's current nursing license doesn't reflect these qualifications. No, Obi agreed. It reflects her civilian nursing license, which was the basis on which she was hired. The question before the board is whether her actions on Thursday night were reckless and unauthorized, or whether they were the actions of a trained specialist responding correctly to clinical emergencies in front of her. This document answers that question. Greer spoke for the first time. The document doesn't change what the license says. The license governs her scope of practice as a hospital employee, Obi said. It doesn't govern what she's capable of, what she was trained to do, or whether the outcome of her actions was correct. She paused. Petty Officer Webb and Petty Officer Kowalski are alive. The clinical record is unambiguous about why. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the door opened. Mara had known this was coming. Voss had texted her at 8:03 that the Medical Executive Committee had convened and that the testimony had been admitted. What she hadn't known was how it would arrive. It arrived as Susan Park standing up and saying, "I need to inform the board that the Medical Executive Committee convened an emergency session yesterday afternoon regarding clinical quality concerns in the emergency department. The committee's proceedings are now on record and relevant to this review." She set a document on the table. "I'm submitting those proceedings formally." Okafor looked at her. "Susan, this review has a specific—" "I know what the review has," Park said, "and I know that the State Health Authority received a formal complaint about this institution's emergency department yesterday morning, which means anything this board decides today is subject to external review. I want everything relevant to be in the record." Pratt's attorney was writing something. Pratt himself finally moved. A small shift in posture, the first sign of something other than patience. The Medical Executive Committee proceedings contained Voss's testimony, submitted in writing, a detailed account of the Thursday night events, the clinical assessments Mara had made, the outcomes, and a categorical statement that Senior Chief Webb's death from tension pneumothorax had been prevented by intervention that was performed by a trained individual operating within her actual competence. It also contained Ben Taggart's written account, and it contained Renata Osei's compiled documentation of the 5 prior staff members, the pattern, the NDA settlements, the timelines. The room did not explode. Rooms like this one didn't explode. What happened instead was slower and in some ways more consequential. The particular silence that settled over a group of people who were processing information that made the thing they had been prepared to do no longer obviously possible. One of the 2 administrators Mara didn't know by name read through Taggart's account and set it down and looked at Okafor. The look was not conspiratorial. It was the look of someone asking a question without words. Okafor did not answer it. Greer was looking at the Taggart document. His expression had changed. Not collapsed, not yet, but something behind the controlled professional surface had shifted. The specific shift of someone recalculating against information they had not expected to be in the room. Obi said, "The board should also be aware that consent calendar items from board minutes 22 and 16 months ago document the authorization of 2 NDA-based employment settlements by the hospital's chief operating officer under standing delegation authority in cases directly related to the clinical pattern documented in the Medical Executive Committee proceedings." She put the board minutes on the table, not copies. The original publicly available documents, printed, with the relevant consent calendar items marked. Pratt's attorney said, "These are routine administrative matters. They are documented authorizations of payments made to suppress complaints about patient care under a specific physician," Obi said. "I understand the board may wish to characterize them differently. The State Health Authority may have a different view." Pratt said something to his attorney that Mara couldn't hear. The attorney wrote something down. Park said, "I want to move that the scope of today's review be expanded to include the pattern of staff complaints and institutional responses as documented in the Medical Executive Committee proceedings." Okafor said, "That expansion would require a vote of the board." "Then let's vote," said the administrator who had looked at Okafor after reading Taggart's account. His name, Mara would learn later, was Raymond Cho. He had been on the board for 3 years and had no pre-existing relationship with Pratt, and had been placed on the review board by a rotation schedule that Pratt had not thought to check. The vote was 3-2. Park, Cho, and the second physician voted to expand. Okafor and the second administrator voted against. Majority. The scope of the review expanded. What happened next took 2 hours and was, in the specific way of institutional proceedings, both consequential and unglamorous. Documents were submitted and reviewed. The board asked questions that Obi answered or redirected. Greer's attorney, he had brought one of Pratt's lawyers to sit beside him, which now looked, in the room's current composition, like what it was. Attempted twice to reframe the clinical events as a question of protocol rather than outcomes. And both times Park countered with the specific precision of a quality assurance physician who had been waiting 18 months for this room. Ashby was asked about Ben Taggart's case. She said she had followed standard review protocols. She was asked whether she had been aware of the pattern of complaints before Taggart's case. She said she could not speak to records she had not personally reviewed. She was asked whether her decision to initiate Mara's administrative leave on Thursday night had been made in consultation with Dr. Greer. She paused before answering. The pause was its own kind of answer. Greer was asked about Taggart's patient, the septic presentation, the escalation recommendation, the outcome. He said the management had been appropriate to the standard of care at the time. He was then shown the patient's own medical record, which had been obtained by Park through the Medical Executive Committee process, and asked to reconcile the documented outcome with that characterization. He said outcomes were not always predictive of management quality. He said it with complete control, and the control itself was damaging, the specific damage of a man who had learned to be so polished in his deflections that the polish had become the problem. At 11:47, Okafor called a recess. In the corridor outside the boardroom, Mara stood with Obi and said nothing for a moment. "How does this land?" she asked. Obi considered. "Cho is going to push for a full departmental review. Park will second it. Okafor doesn't have the votes to contain it." She paused. "Greer is not going to survive this." Pratt? Pratt is a harder question. The consent calendar entries establish his signature, but establishing that he knew the full scope of what he was authorizing is a different evidentiary standard. Obi looked at her. "That may take longer." Mara nodded. She had expected that. Some things moved fast and some things moved at the speed of institutions, which was slower and uglier and involved more lawyers. They reconvened at 12:20. Okafor's demeanor had changed during the recess. Not dramatically. He was still controlled, still procedurally correct, but the specific comfortable authority he had entered the room with that morning was not fully intact, and the people around the table could see it. Raymond Cho moved for the formation of an independent clinical review committee to examine the emergency department's practices and outcomes over the prior 24 months. Park seconded. The vote was again 3-2. Okafor voted against and did not explain himself, which was itself a kind of exposure. Mara's administrative leave was suspended pending the outcome of the independent review. The board's formal language was careful. It was not a reinstatement, not yet, not until the review completed, but it was a reversal of the immediate action, and it was on the record. Greer's clinical privileges were placed under supervision pending the independent review. That one passed 4-1. The second administrator, who had voted with Okafor on the scope expansion, broke from him on the privilege question, and the break was public and the room noted it. The meeting ended at 1:15. Mara walked out of the boardroom and into the corridor and stood for a moment in the institutional quiet of the third floor and felt the specific weight of the morning settling. Not finished. She knew it wasn't finished. Pratt was still in the building somewhere, with his 2 lawyers and his 30-year relationship with the board chair, and the particular determination of a man who had been managing problems successfully for 22 months, and was not going to accept that the management had stopped working in a single Monday morning session. Greer still had his license. Ashby was still the director of patient services. The NDA agreement still legally bound 5 people from speaking publicly about what they knew. Not finished, but different. She walked down the corridor toward the stairs, and Voss was at the bottom of the stairwell when she came down. Not the whole group, just him, standing there with his arms at his sides the way he stood when he was waiting for a sit rep. "How did it go?" he said. "Greer's on supervised privileges," she said. "Independent review committee. My leave is suspended." He nodded once. "Pratt?" "Still standing, for now." He accepted this. "What do you need?" She thought about it. "I need to know if the health authority inquiry has teeth, the NDA settlements, whether the authority has the power to review them. I'll ask Everett. And I need someone to find Lena Farrow." Voss looked at her. "She's under NDA," he said. "I know," Mara said, "but NDAs don't prohibit contact, they prohibit disclosure. If she knows there's a formal inquiry now, a state health authority investigation, she may have the ability to speak within that context. There are whistleblower provisions that can supersede non-disclosure agreements in patient safety investigations." She looked at him. "She deserves to know that door might be open." Voss studied her for a moment. "I'll find her," he said. She walked out through the lobby and into the gray November afternoon. The cold hit her face, and she stopped on the steps and breathed it in and looked at the parking lot. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was an email from a Bayside General administrative address, sent at 1:22 p.m., which was 7 minutes ago, while she had still been in the building. She opened it. It was brief. Formal hospital letterhead, administrative language, 4 sentences. The third sentence said that in light of the board proceedings and the state health authority inquiry, A comprehensive audit of clinical documentation in the emergency department had been initiated, effective immediately, by the hospital's compliance office. The fourth sentence said that the audit would include a review of all incident reports, near-miss documentation, and patient outcome records for the prior 24 months. Mara read the fourth sentence twice and understood immediately what it meant. The compliance office had initiated an audit, not the board, not the independent review committee, the compliance office, which reported directly to Gerald Pratt. She stood on the steps in the cold and stared at the email and understood, with the specific clarity of someone who had spent years learning to read the difference between what a move looked like and what it actually was, that Pratt had just initiated control of the audit that was supposed to examine his own conduct. He was not done. He was, in fact, already 3 steps ahead of where she thought he was. And in the audit he now controlled, every document she had relied on this morning was about to be reviewed, cataloged, and potentially managed by the office of the man it implicated. She forwarded the email to Obi before she'd made it to the bottom of the hospital steps. Obi called back in 4 minutes. "I see it. He's going to use the audit to manage the document trail," Mara said. "The incident reports, the outcome records. If his office controls the audit process, he controls what the independent review committee sees." "He can't destroy records under an active health authority inquiry," Obi said. "That's obstruction. His lawyers know that. He doesn't need to destroy them. He needs to contextualize them, frame them before anyone else does. An audit report written by a compliant compliance officer can take the same set of facts and produce a narrative that looks like due diligence rather than concealment." Obi was quiet for 2 seconds. "I'm calling Renata. The health authority needs to know the compliance office moved within 7 minutes of the board meeting ending." "The timing itself is the evidence," Mara said. "Yes," Obi said. "It is." She ended the call and stood in the parking lot and looked at the gray sky and did the thing she had learned to do in situations where the ground shifted unexpectedly. She stopped moving and thought before she acted because the first reaction in a fast-changing situation was almost never the best one. Pratt had moved fast. That was telling. A man who was confident the board would protect him didn't move within 7 minutes. He moved fast because the board hadn't protected him the way he'd expected, and fast movement from a cornered position usually meant one of 2 things: desperation or a secondary plan that had been ready in advance. She thought about which one this was. The compliance office audit had the structure of something prepared in advance. You didn't draft audit authorization language in 7 minutes. The paperwork existed before the meeting ended, which meant Pratt had come to Monday morning's session with a contingency already written, which meant he had known the board session might not go his way, which meant someone had told him, before Monday morning, that the room was not going to be as controlled as he'd arranged it to be. She thought about who had known enough to warn him. The answer was not comfortable. She called Calloway. "Someone told Pratt the board wasn't sealed," she said. "Before this morning. He had the audit paperwork ready." Calloway was quiet for a moment. "How many people knew what Park was doing?" "Park, me, Obi, Renata, you, Voss." "Not a large group." "No." "Renata made calls to the health authority Friday night," Calloway said slowly. "Those calls went through intake staff she had existing relationships with. It's possible someone in that chain—" "It doesn't matter who," Mara said. "What matters is that the audit is moving and we have maybe 24 hours before it produces something that frames the record against us." "What do you need?" "The health authority needs to place the compliance office's audit under external supervision. Immediately. Before Pratt's compliance officer touches a single document. That requires a formal petition from the inquiring party," Calloway said. "Renata." "She's already on the phone with Obi." "Then they'll figure it out." A pause. "Mara, there's something else." The tone told her it was significant. "What?" "Voss found Lena Farrow." She waited. "She's been in Spokane," Calloway said, "working at a physical therapy clinic. She's been there for 5 months. Another pause. "She signed an NDA, but she also kept a personal journal during the weeks before she resigned. Not a legal document, a personal record. Dates, conversations, exact language Greer used when she raised her concerns. Exact language Ashby used when she told Farrow the complaint was being closed." "A journal isn't bound by an NDA," Mara said. "Her attorney confirmed it this morning," Calloway said. "She called an employment lawyer the moment Voss reached her. Personal contemporaneous notes made prior to and independent of the NDA are not covered by the agreement's scope. Mara closed her eyes for 1 second. She wants to submit it, Calloway said, to the health authority inquiry. She's been waiting for a mechanism that would let her say something without violating the agreement, and this is it. A pause that carried something Calloway rarely allowed into her voice. She cried when Voss explained the whistleblower provision. Mara stood in the parking lot and said nothing for a moment. 5 months in Spokane. A physical therapy clinic. A journal she had kept during the worst weeks of her professional life and had held on to for months without knowing if it would ever matter to anyone. Tell her it matters, Mara said. Voss already did. The next 36 hours were the kind that collapsed time. A continuous operational tempo that erased the distinction between Monday afternoon and Tuesday morning, that reduced the world to the sequence of necessary actions and the people executing them. Obi and Renata worked the health authority petition for external audit supervision and had it filed by 4 p.m. Monday. The health authority's duty officer, who had been briefed on the case's urgency by Renata's contact, placed a hold on the compliance office audit at 5:47 p.m. before Pratt's compliance officer had accessed the first file. Pratt's attorney filed an objection. The objection was reviewed and denied by 8 a.m. Tuesday on the grounds that the compliance office's structural relationship to the named party in the inquiry created an irresolvable conflict. The audit was transferred to an independent external firm contracted by the health authority. Gerald Pratt received written notification of the transfer at 9 a.m. Tuesday. He resigned from his position as Chief Operating Officer of Bayside General Hospital at 2:17 p.m. the same day. The resignation letter, which became part of the public record when the health authority inquiry was formally published 6 weeks later, cited personal reasons. It was 4 sentences long. It did not mention Russell Greer, Mara Donnelly, Lena Farrow, Ben Taggart, or any of the other 4 individuals whose careers had been managed into silence, while Pratt's signature sat on the authorization documents. It said nothing about the 30-year friendship with Warren Okafor, who submitted his own resignation from the board chair position 40 minutes after Pratt's letter was filed. 2 men with 30 years between them, and in the end they both left through the same door they had used to keep other people out. Greer's supervised privileges became a full suspension of clinical duties pending the external audit's findings. He retained his medical license through this period. License matters moved at their own pace, through the state medical board rather than the hospital, and that process would take months. But he was out of the emergency department. His office was reassigned. The rotation board that had listed his name at the top of every overnight trauma call was updated, and the name that replaced his was Dr. Theo Sato, who was not ready for the responsibility and knew it, and took it anyway with the specific seriousness of someone who understood what it had cost to get to this point. Nina Ashby remained in her position through the initial inquiry period, which was the outcome that sat least comfortably with Mara. Ashby's involvement had been real. Taggart's account made that clear, and Farrow's journal confirmed it. But her role had been one of omission and institutional compliance rather than active direction, and the health authority's inquiry, which dealt in provable conduct rather than moral assessment, found insufficient grounds for a formal action against her individually. She knew this. She also knew that everyone in the building knew what the inquiry had uncovered, and that knowledge lived in the hallways and the staff meetings and the small daily interactions in a way that no formal action could have replicated and no formal finding could have erased. She submitted a voluntary transfer request to a non-clinical administrative role 6 weeks after the inquiry closed. The transfer was approved. She left the patient services directorship without ceremony. Mara learned about the transfer from Greta Simmons, the weekend charge nurse, who texted her a single sentence, "Ashby's out of patient services." Mara read it and put the phone down and felt the specific complicated thing you felt when an outcome was correct, but the path to it had been longer and harder than it should have been, and when the people who had been hurt along the way would not get back the years they had spent carrying the weight of it. She had been reinstated to active duty at Bayside General on the Tuesday after the board session, pending the full inquiry completion. She went back to work on the Wednesday overnight shift, same hours, same unit, same supply cart she had been stocking when all of this began. The department was different, not immediately, not visibly, not in the way that things looked different in stories. The linoleum was the same. The vending machine in the corridor still took your dollar without arguing 70% of the time. The ventilation system hummed. The coffee was the same specific quality of bad. But something in the air of the place had shifted, the way air shifted after a window was opened. Not transformed, just moved, carrying something new. Nurses asked questions at shift handoff that they hadn't asked before. Not dramatically, not all at once, just incrementally. Small questions, the kind that were always reasonable to ask, but that people in suppressed environments stopped asking because the cost of asking wasn't worth the return. Questions about patient presentations and care sequencing, and whether a particular flag warranted escalation, and what the protocol was if the attending disagreed with a nursing assessment. Questions that had always been appropriate. Questions that had stopped being asked. They were being asked again. Mara answered them when she was asked, and did not make a production of any of it, because the point was not to be visible as the person who had changed things. The point was for the things to be changed. Lena Farrow's journal submission to the health authority became part of the formal inquiry record, and its inclusion triggered a review of all 5 NDA settlements. The review found that 3 of the 5 agreements included provisions that were unenforceable under state whistleblower protection statutes as applied to patient safety disclosures. The other 2 were referred to the State Attorney General's office for further review on public interest grounds. It was not a clean resolution. Clean resolutions lived in the version of this story where everyone received exactly what they deserved in precise proportion to what they had done. This was not that version. This was the version where most of what was correctable got corrected, where most of the people who had been silenced got at least a formal acknowledgement that they should not have been, and where the people responsible faced consequences that were serious but imperfect. The consequences that institutions produced rather than the consequences that justice required in its most absolute sense. Ben Taggart was offered reinstatement. He declined. He said he liked the East Side Clinic and was not interested in returning to a building that had spent 3 months building a paper case against him. He said this without bitterness, which was the more honest version of having gotten to the other side of something. Mara understood that. She also understood something else, something she had begun to understand in the parking lot on Monday afternoon and had continued to understand in the weeks since, in the quiet of night shifts and the accumulation of small moments that didn't individually announce their significance. She had come to Creston Falls to disappear. She had disappeared successfully for 7 months, and then a helicopter had gone down, and a man had been dying, and her hands had moved before her decision to move was fully formed, and every careful construction she had built around herself had come apart in approximately 45 seconds. She used to think about that as a failure of the plan. She had stopped thinking about it that way. The plan had been built on a premise that turned out to be wrong, that a person could fully separate from what they were trained to do and become, that you could set down the thing you were best at and be at peace with having set it down. She had believed that because she had needed to believe it, because the alternative, that she was always going to be the person in the room who saw what no one else was seeing, felt, at the time, like a burden rather than a capacity. It had cost her. The years since leaving active duty had cost her in ways she was still accounting for. That part was real. But standing in the trauma bay with a needle in her hand and Marcus Webb's monitor climbing back toward normal, she had not felt the weight of a burden. She had felt the clean, exact feeling of doing the thing she was made for. In the moment it was needed, without hesitation. You couldn't set that down. You could pretend to, for a while. The independent external audit of Bayside General's emergency department findings were published formally in January. They ran to 63 pages and were, in the specific language of institutional documentation, comprehensive, damning, and written in a register that drained all the human texture out of what had happened to 7 people over 22 months. The audit found systematic suppression of clinical safety concerns. It found documentation of retaliatory institutional action against staff who raised those concerns. It found that the NDA settlements had been authorized with full knowledge of the complaints they were designed to contain. It found outcome data consistent with the nursing flags that had been dismissed, patterns in specific patient populations that the emergency department's managed metrics had not reflected because the managed metrics had been, in certain respects, managed. The audit also contained a section on the events of the Thursday night in November that had initiated the current inquiry. That section was 11 paragraphs long and addressed the clinical events, the interventions, the outcomes, and the qualifications of the nurse who had performed them. The final sentence of that section read, "The evidence supports a finding that the interventions performed by the nursing staff member were consistent with her documented training and were causally significant in the positive outcomes for 2 patients." Causally significant. It was the language of a formal audit document, bloodless and precise and entirely inadequate for what it was actually describing, which was that 2 men were alive because someone who had been called slow for 7 months had moved when no one else was moving. Mara read the audit report on a Thursday morning in January, sitting at the same kitchen table where she had sat the morning after the Thursday night, with coffee that was not quite the right temperature and the kind of gray winter light that gave everything the flat quality of a document rather than a life. She read it through once, then she closed her laptop and sat for a while. Her phone had 3 unread texts, one from Calloway, one from Obi, one from Voss. She knew without opening them that they were all versions of the same thing, acknowledgement, checking in, the quiet communication of people who had been in the same fight and were now standing in the aftermath of it. She opened Voss's first. It said, "Audit's out. You should read the last section." She typed back, "I did." His response came in 30 seconds. "How are you?" She thought about how to answer that. She typed, "Working tonight, overnight shift." There was a pause. Then, "That's an answer. It's the one I've got." Another pause. Then a final message. "Webb wants to know if you're going to be at the recognition ceremony next month. The unit is submitting a commendation." She read the word commendation and felt the complicated thing it produced. Not pride exactly, more the feeling of being seen accurately after a long period of being seen incorrectly, which was its own kind of vertigo, the adjustment required when the story about you changes and you have to figure out how to stand inside the new version. She typed, "Tell him I'll think about it." She knew she was going to say yes. She just needed another day to get there. She put the phone down and got up and washed her coffee cup and put on her jacket because it was January in Washington, and the apartment took a long time to warm up. She stood at the window and looked at the street where nothing particular was happening. A car passing. A woman walking a dog that was not interested in walking. The bare branches of a tree at the curb holding the cold gray air. 7 months ago, she had come to this city to be nobody. She was not nobody. She had never been nobody. That had been the fiction, the one she'd constructed and maintained and defended, the one she had told herself was peace when it was actually absence. The difference between peace and absence was something she had understood intellectually for years, and had finally stopped being able to pretend she didn't understand personally. Peace was not the removal of the thing you were. Peace was finding a way to carry it that didn't destroy you. She was still working on that part. She expected she would be working on it for a while, but she was working on it in a hospital where the nurses asked questions at shift handoff, where 3 people were alive who might not have been, where 5 people who had been paid to be quiet now had formal documentation that they had been right, where a compliance office audit had been stopped before it could manage the truth into a more convenient shape, because someone had noticed the timing and understood what it meant and had acted on that understanding before the window closed. She thought about what Calloway had asked her, sitting at the kitchen table in the early morning after the Thursday night. "Are you doing this because you want to fix the hospital, or because it's the first thing in 4 years that's made you feel like yourself?" She had said both. She still thought that was the honest answer, and she had come to believe in the weeks since that both could be true at once, that doing something for a complicated set of reasons didn't make the thing less worth doing, that showing up in a moment because you couldn't not show up and then continuing to show up because other people needed you to were not contradictory motivations, that the woman who had wanted quiet and the woman who had pushed a needle into a man's chest to stop him dying were the same person, not competing versions of her, not a before and after, just her. Complicated and imperfect and in possession of hands that didn't shake under pressure, which was a thing she had earned through years she couldn't fully describe in polite conversation, and which she was no longer pretending she hadn't earned. She had a night shift in 11 hours. She put on her shoes and went outside because the apartment was still cold and the street was ordinary, and she had learned a long time ago that ordinary was something you appreciated most clearly when you had spent enough time in situations that were the opposite of ordinary. The dog was still arguing with its owner about direction. The tree at the curb was bare and gray and completely itself. Mara Donnelly walked down the street in the January cold with her hands in her pockets and her right leg doing its small, familiar hesitation with each step. And she did not think about being invisible, because she was done with that now. And some things, once you were done with them, stayed done. She had been underestimated for 7 months by people who mistook her quiet for emptiness, her stillness for absence, her patience for weakness. She understood why they had made that mistake. Quiet people who carry the weight of what they know without advertising it tend to look, from the outside, like people who don't know very much. The truth was the opposite. The ones who carry it silently are carrying it that way because they know exactly what it weighs, and they have learned, through the specific education of doing hard things in difficult conditions over a long time, that weight announced is weight that slows you down when the moment comes and speed is what matters. She had been fast when it counted. She had been ready when no one expected her to be. And the room where people had called her slow was now running differently, and the man who had called her that was no longer in it. And 3 families who did not know her name had someone at their dinner table who would not otherwise be there. That was not a perfect outcome. It was a real one. Real was, in her experience, considerably harder to come by and considerably more worth having than perfect had ever been. She walked to the end of the block and turned toward the water, where the harbor was gray and cold and absolutely indifferent to the last several months of her life, which was exactly what she needed it to be. She stood there for a while. Then she turned around and walked back. She had work tomorrow, and she intended to be ready for it.